Summer dust swirled across the streets of Redemption Springs as three men from the Rawlins Gang swaggered into the town's only hospital, their spurs leaving cruel marks on the freshly swept wooden floors. They couldn't have known that the gentle-voiced nurse tending to a child's fever, her auburn hair neatly pinned beneath her white cap, was once known as Swift Sally Hawkins, the most feared peacekeeper in the Arizona Territory. The woman who had single-handedly ended the notorious Thompson Gang in a legendary shootout that left 7 men dead before the echo of the first shot had faded. The same woman who had disappeared 5 years ago, leaving behind nothing but whispered tales and a reputation that made hardened gunfighters check their holsters twice. At the nurse's station, Sally Cooper carefully measured out fever medicine, her steady hands betraying nothing of her past. Even as the Rawlins boys' shadows darkened her doorway, those same hands that had once outdrawn the fastest guns west of the Mississippi now cradled a small glass vial with a healer's gentle touch. 15 years of keeping the peace had taught her that some storms announce themselves with thunder, while others roll in quiet as a rattler's approach. This one, she knew, would demand every skill she'd hoped to leave buried with her old life. The year was 1875, and Redemption Springs was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one that bares its teeth, but the one that hides in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jack Rawlins and his crew had terrorized 3 territories, burning and pillaging their way through every town that resisted their demands for protection money. But they were about to learn that threatening a simple nurse could be the last mistake they'd ever make. Greater than. Sarah Cooper's routine at Redemption Springs Hospital never varied. Every morning she arrived before dawn, her sensible boots clicking softly against the wooden boardwalk as she made her way through the sleeping town. The hospital, a converted church with its tall windows and quiet dignity, had become her sanctuary over the past 5 years. Inside its whitewashed walls, she had built a new life far removed from the weight of the gun belt she'd once worn. The morning sun painted long shadows across the ward as Sarah checked on her patients. Old Mr. Jenkins fighting pneumonia, young Tommy Wilson recovering from a broken arm, and little Maria Sanchez, whose fever had finally broken during the night. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, changing bandages, administering medicines, offering comfort with a gentle touch that gave no hint of the calluses earned from years of gunfighting. Nurse Cooper? Maria's mother looked up from her vigil beside her daughter's bed. "I don't know how to thank you, the way you stayed with her all night." Sarah smiled, adjusting Maria's blanket. "No thanks needed, Mrs. Sanchez. It's what I'm here for." The words were genuine, though they carried a weight Mrs. Sanchez couldn't understand. Every life Sarah saved now felt like balancing the scales against those she'd taken in her previous life. Dr. Thomas Mitchell, the hospital's chief physician, often remarked that he'd never seen a nurse with such steady hands during a crisis. He didn't know that Sarah had learned that steadiness long before she'd ever picked up a thermometer in moments when the slightest tremor could mean the difference between life and death. The hospital's routine wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket. Morning rounds, medication schedules, the quiet competence of her fellow nurses. Everything here had order, purpose, and peace. It was everything her life as Swift Sally hadn't been, and she guarded this new existence with the same vigilance she'd once used to protect frontier towns. But sometimes, in quiet moments between tasks, Sarah's hand would brush against her right hip, an unconscious gesture reaching for a weapon no longer there. The Colt peacemaker that had been as much a part of her as her own heartbeat now lay wrapped in oiled cloth, hidden beneath the floorboards of her modest home. She told herself she kept it only as a reminder, never admitting that some instincts run too deep to truly forget. As she organized supplies in the medicine cabinet, Sarah caught her reflection in the glass. Auburn hair streaked with early gray, laugh lines around eyes that had once carried only steel, hands that now healed instead of harmed. 5 years of peace had changed her, softened some of her edges, but hadn't erased the core of steel beneath the nurse's uniform. Little did she know, as she went about her morning routine, that the peace she'd built so carefully was about to shatter. The Rawlins Gang's arrival in Redemption Springs would soon force her to reconcile both sides of her nature, the healer she'd become and the fighter she'd never truly stopped being. Greater than. The afternoon sun streamed through the hospital's high windows as Sarah worked alongside Jenny Miller, the youngest nurse on staff. Jenny's hands trembled slightly as she attempted to clean a miner's nasty gash, her inexperience showing in every hesitant movement. "Steady now," Sarah murmured, positioning herself to block the patient's view of his own wound. "Remember what I taught you about pressure points." Her voice carried the same calm authority she'd once used to direct deputies during shootouts, though Jenny would never know that. "I don't know how you stay so calm, Miss Cooper," Jenny whispered, her movements becoming more assured under Sarah's guidance, especially with injuries like this. Sarah's mind flashed to a night in Tombstone when she'd bandaged her own bullet wound while pursuing the Vasquez brothers. "Practice," she replied simply, "and perspective. This man's going home to his family tonight because of your care." Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, his graying mustache twitching with approval as he observed their work. "Excellent technique, Nurse Miller. I see Nurse Cooper's teaching is paying off." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "Sarah, might I have a word when you're finished here?" In the doctor's office, Sarah noticed how he kept glancing toward the window overlooking the town's main street. "Trouble?" she asked, falling into old habits of threat assessment. "Perhaps." Mitchell ran a hand through his thinning hair. "3 men rode in this morning. They've been asking questions about the hospital, our finances. I don't like the look of them." Sarah's spine stiffened, though her expression remained neutral. "The Rawlins Gang," she said quietly. "They've been moving through the territory, demanding protection money from businesses." Mitchell's eyebrows rose. "You seem well informed about such matters." "I read the newspapers," Sarah deflected smoothly, "and people talk when they're being tended to. Well, whatever their intentions, we can't afford any protection payments. We barely keep enough medicines stocked as it is." He sighed heavily. "I'll speak with the sheriff later." Sarah nodded, already knowing Sheriff Wilson was 3 days' ride away, investigating cattle rustlers. The timing wasn't coincidental. The Rawlins Gang always did their research. Back in the ward, Sarah went about her duties with heightened awareness. She positioned herself near windows, when possible, noted exit routes, assessed which patients could be moved quickly if needed, old habits surfacing like muscle memory. As she changed little Maria's bandages, the girl looked up with innocent curiosity. "Miss Cooper, why do you always stand so you can see the door?" Sarah smiled, caught off guard by the child's observation. "Just a habit, dear. Now let's check that fever of yours." Evening approached, painting the ward in amber light. Sarah watched Jenny help the last outpatients leave, noting how the young nurse had grown more confident in just a few months under her guidance. She felt a familiar ache, the same pride she'd once taken in training young deputies, showing them how to survive in a violent world. But this was different, she told herself. Here she taught healing, not hunting, life, not death. Yet, as she watched the sun set over Redemption Springs, Sarah Cooper couldn't shake the feeling that soon she might need to draw on both sets of skills. Greater than. The Arizona Sentinel lay folded on Sarah's small kitchen table, its bold headline stealing her appetite for breakfast. Rawlins Gang strikes again, 3 dead in Silver Creek raid. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the newspaper, mind racing back to a similar headline 15 years ago. Swift Sally strikes again. Thompson Gang falls to legendary peacekeeper. A knock at her back door interrupted her thoughts. Through the lace curtain, she recognized Jenny's anxious face. Sarah quickly folded the newspaper, tucking it beneath a stack of medical texts. "Miss Cooper," Jenny burst in, her usually neat uniform showing signs of haste. "They're at the hospital. Those men, they're demanding to see Dr. Mitchell, but he's out at the Peterson farm delivering twins." Sarah's hand automatically moved to her hip before she caught herself. "Calm down, Jenny. Tell me exactly what's happening." "Three men, led by someone named Jack Rawlins. They're in the front office, refusing to leave until they discuss business arrangements with whoever's in charge." Jenny wrung her hands. "Miss Cooper, I've heard stories about these men. In Silver Creek, they—" "I know what they did in Silver Creek," Sarah interrupted softly. "Go back to the hospital. Tell them the acting administrator will be there shortly." After Jenny left, Sarah moved swiftly to her bedroom. Kneeling beside her bed, she pried up the loose floorboard she'd carefully prepared 5 years ago. The oiled cloth wrapping felt familiar under her fingers as she unwrapped just enough to see the silvered grip of her peacemaker. For a moment, she was tempted to take it, to feel its reassuring weight again. Instead, she recovered the weapon and replaced the floorboard. Swift Sally would have strapped on that gun and confronted the Rawlins Gang head-on. But she wasn't Swift Sally anymore. She was Sarah Cooper, head nurse at Redemption Springs Hospital. She had to find another way. As she walked to the hospital, Sarah's mind drifted to her last gunfight. 5 years ago, in a dusty street in Yuma, she'd faced down the Carson brothers. The fight had left 3 men dead, and Sarah with a choice: continue down that path of violence or find a different way to protect people. The hospital came into view, its white walls bright in the morning sun. Through the front windows, Sarah could see 3 horses tied at the hitching post. Good horses, she noted automatically, chosen for speed rather than show, the kind outlaws favored for quick getaways. Before entering, she paused to straighten her nurse's cap and smooth her apron. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm. She'd faced down worse men than Jack Rawlins, but never in a hospital full of vulnerable patients, never with so much more than her own life at stake. "Lord," she whispered, a habit picked up from Dr. Mitchell, "help me find a peaceful way through this." But even as she prayed, another part of her, the part that would always be Swift Sally, was noting exits, angles, and potential cover. Some instincts never die. They just wait for the right moment to resurface. Greater than. Jack Rawlins lounged in Dr. Mitchell's office chair like a wolf making itself at home in a sheepfold. His dusty boots rested on the polished desk, deliberately smudging the morning's paperwork. 2 men flanked him: Cole Turner, a scarred mountain of a man whose huge hands could crush a throat as easily as shake a hand, and Luke Hayes, whose boyish face belied the cold calculation in his eyes. "Well, well," Rawlins drawled as Sarah entered. "They send us a nurse instead of the good doctor." His smile never reached his eyes, which remained fixed on Sarah with predatory interest. "I'm Sarah Cooper, head nurse and acting administrator," she replied, her voice carrying the calm authority she'd developed over years of facing down much more dangerous men. "Dr. Mitchell is attending to patients. How may I help you, gentlemen?" Rawlins swung his feet off the desk with theatrical slowness. "Gentlemen," she says. "Hear that, boys? Been a while since anyone called us that." He stood, trying to use his height to intimidate. "We're businessmen, Miss Cooper. We provide protection services to establishments that can't rely on the local law to keep them safe." Sarah noted how Cole's hand rested near his gun, how Luke had positioned himself near the window. Professional gunmen, not common thugs. This wouldn't be simple. "The hospital is neutral ground, Mr. Rawlins," she said, moving to stand behind her own desk. "We treat anyone who needs care, lawman, outlaw, and citizen alike. We have no need for additional protection." "Funny thing about protection," Rawlins replied, his voice hardening. "Like medicine, it works best when taken before you need it. Silver Creek thought they didn't need our services either. Now their doctor operates out of a tent because their clinic burned down. He picked up a bottle of laudanum, studying it with exaggerated interest. Terrible accident. Shouldn't keep so many flammable medicines around. Sarah's fingers twitched, muscle memory reaching for a gun that wasn't there. Instead, she folded her hands calmly on the desk. "Are you threatening a hospital, Mr. Rawlins? A place that exists solely to help people?" "Threatening?" Rawlins set the bottle down with exaggerated care. "No, ma'am. Just expressing concern for fire safety. $50 a week would buy a lot of peace of mind." "We use every dollar we have for medicines and supplies," Sarah replied. "Many of our patients can't pay. We get by on donations and the goodwill of the community." Luke Hayes laughed softly. "Goodwill don't stop bullets or prevent accidents, ma'am." Sarah stood, drawing herself to her full height. For a moment, the steel of Swift Sally flashed in her eyes. "Neither does bullying sick people and healers, Mr. Hayes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients to attend to." "You've got spirit, Miss Cooper," Rawlins said, his smile turning ugly. "I like that. Makes it more interesting when it breaks. You've got till sundown tomorrow to reconsider our generous offer." He gestured to his men. "Let's ride, boys. I believe our message has been delivered." As they left, Sarah remained standing, her heart racing despite her calm exterior. She'd seen their kind before, men who mistook kindness for weakness, who preyed on those they thought couldn't fight back. Once she would have settled this with 6 rounds of frontier justice. But now she had patients to protect, staff to think about. Through the window she watched them mount up, noting how their horses were positioned for a quick departure, how their gun belts were worn low for easy drawing. Professional killers, every one of them, and they'd just declared war on her hospital. "Miss Cooper?" Jenny's voice trembled from the doorway. "What are we going to do?" Sarah turned to her young colleague, her face composed despite the storm raging inside her. "We're going to do our jobs, Jenny. We're going to take care of our patients." But in her mind, Swift Sally was already planning for a confrontation she'd spent 5 years trying to avoid. Greater than. Sarah arrived at the hospital before sunrise the next morning, earlier than usual. The pre-dawn air carried a bite of autumn chill, but it wasn't the cold that had pulled her from bed. Years of experience had taught her that men like Rawlins often delivered their warnings in the quiet hours before dawn. She wasn't wrong. The hospital's front window lay shattered, glass glinting like frost on the boardwalk. A rock the size of a man's fist rested among the broken shards, wrapped in a note written in a crude hand. "Time's running out." Sarah surveyed the damage with the calculating eye of a tactician rather than a nurse. The window was visible from 3 vantage points in town: the saloon's upper floor, the bank's roof, and the bell tower of the Presbyterian church. Any one of them would make an excellent sniper's nest. Swift Sally would have already been planning counterpositions. Sarah Cooper just started sweeping up glass. Dr. Mitchell arrived as she was finishing, his face gray with worry. "I heard about yesterday the Rawlins Gang." He trailed off, seeing the window. "Dear Lord." "We need to move the patients away from the windows," Sarah said, her voice practical. "The children especially. We can convert the back storage room into a ward." "Sarah, perhaps we should consider their offer. $50 a week is steep, but if we all contribute—" "It won't stop at 50, she interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that made the doctor blink in surprise. "Men like that, their appetite grows with the feeding. We pay once, they'll demand more. Soon they'll own the hospital in all but name." "Then what do you suggest? We can't fight them." Sarah's hand brushed her hip unconsciously. "No," she said softly, "we can't." But her mind was already working, calculating angles and options just as she had in her peacekeeping days. "But we can be smart. Help me move the patients." Throughout the morning, Sarah orchestrated a quiet reorganization of the hospital. Beds were shifted away from windows, supplies relocated to more secure locations. She sent Jenny to gather empty bottles from the saloon. For mixing medicines, she claimed, though she was really creating makeshift alarm systems near potential entry points. "Miss Cooper," little Maria called from her new bed in the converted storage room, "are the bad men coming back?" Sarah smoothed the girl's dark hair, buying time to choose her words carefully. "Some people think they can take whatever they want, Maria, but there are always others who stand up to them." "Like Swift Sally?" the child asked innocently. "My papa tells stories about her, how she protected people from bad men." Sarah's hand froze for a moment. "Where did your father hear those stories?" "He was in Silver Creek when she stopped the Thompson Gang. Says she was the fastest draw he ever saw, but she never killed unless she had to." Maria's eyes were wide with admiration. "Papa says she disappeared 5 years ago. Nobody knows where she went." "Perhaps she found another way to help people," Sarah said softly, adjusting Maria's blanket. "Now try to rest." By afternoon, the hospital was as secure as Sarah could make it without revealing her tactical knowledge. She'd created clear lanes of movement, protected spaces, and multiple exit routes, all disguised as simple reorganization for patient comfort. Dr. Mitchell praised her efficiency, never noticing how she'd positioned his desk to provide cover, or how the new arrangement of supply cabinets created a defensible fallback position. As sunset approached, Rawlins' deadline, Sarah stood at the broken window, watching the town's shadows lengthen. She'd spent 5 years building a new life, trading her gun for a nurse's bag. Now those two worlds were about to collide, and she couldn't help wondering if Redemption Springs was big enough for both Sarah Cooper and Swift Sally. Greater than, night settled over Redemption Springs like a dark blanket, bringing with it the kind of silence that made Sarah's nerves sing with tension. She'd volunteered for the night shift, telling Dr. Mitchell she wanted to monitor little Maria's fever. In truth, she knew the Rawlins Gang often did their worst work after sunset. The hospital's halls echoed with the quiet sounds of the night, soft breathing from the patient's ward, the gentle creak of the building settling, the distant hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness. Sarah moved through her rounds with practiced efficiency, but her attention remained fixed on the sounds beyond the walls. "You should be sleeping," she told Jenny, who had stubbornly refused to go home. The younger nurse sat at the front desk, attempting to appear alert despite her obvious fatigue. "I couldn't sleep anyway," Jenny replied, stifling a yawn, "not knowing they might come back. How do you stay so calm, Miss Cooper?" Sarah checked the makeshift alarm system she'd created, bottles and twine near potential entry points. "Practice," she said simply. Then, seeing Jenny's questioning look, she added, "I worked in Chicago during the riots." "You learn to stay calm in a crisis." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had worked in Chicago after helping break up a gang that had been terrorizing the city's medical district. The riot part was true too, though she'd spent more time protecting doctors than assisting them. As midnight approached, Sarah settled into the chair by the back door, positioning herself to watch both the main corridor and the window overlooking the alley. Her hands moved automatically, rolling bandages while her mind wandered to another night watch, 5 years ago in Yuma. She'd been tracking the Carson brothers who'd made the mistake of robbing a hospital to steal morphine. That case had changed everything for her. Seeing the devastation they'd left behind, not just the stolen medicines, but the injured staff, the terrified patients, had made her question her methods. Violence answered with violence only created more victims. A floorboard creaked in the corridor, snapping her back to the present. Jenny had dozed off at the desk, her young face peaceful in sleep. Sarah rose silently, moving with the fluid grace that had once earned her the Swift nickname. It was just Mr. Jenkins, the pneumonia patient, making his way back from the water closet. But Sarah used the moment to check the whole building again. She tested windows, secured doors, and reviewed her mental map of evacuation routes. Old habits died hard. Near 2 in the morning, she heard horses approaching, her body tensed, hand automatically reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. But the riders passed by without slowing, just cowboys heading home from the saloon. Still, she made a mental note to teach Jenny the difference between various hoofbeats. Knowledge like that could save lives. "Tell me about Chicago," Jenny said suddenly, startling Sarah. The young nurse had woken and now sat watching her with curious eyes. What was it like working there? Sarah chose her words carefully, weaving truth with necessary fiction. Chaotic, dangerous sometimes, but it taught me that hospitals have to be ready for anything. That's why we prepare, keep organized, stay vigilant. Is that why you moved everything today? To be prepared? Partly, Sarah admitted. In Chicago, I learned that good preparation can prevent panic. When people panic, they make mistakes. Mistakes cost lives. She didn't mention that she'd learned those lessons long before Chicago in shootouts and standoffs across the Western territories. Didn't explain that the same principles that kept a hospital running smoothly during a crisis also kept people alive during a gunfight. Dawn was approaching when Sarah heard another set of horses moving slowly past the hospital. This time she recognized the particular gait of Rawlins' mount, a distinctive limp in the right front hoof. They were watching, testing, looking for weaknesses. "Jenny," she said quietly, "go home. Get some rest. Tomorrow might be a long day." As the young nurse gathered her things, Sarah watched the street through a gap in the curtains. Rawlins and his men were playing a waiting game, trying to wear them down with fear and exhaustion. It was a tactic she knew well. She'd used it herself in her peacekeeping days. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Swift Sally had once waited 3 days in a freezing barn to catch the Wilson Gang. Sarah Cooper could be just as patient, especially with lives depending on her. Greater than. The pre-dawn hours found Sarah in her small house behind the hospital, finally allowing herself a moment of rest. As she washed the night's tension from her face, her fingers traced the thin scar along her collarbone, a souvenir from her first real gunfight in Dodge City. The mirror revealed others, a small mark above her right eyebrow from a flying bottle in a Tucson saloon, a jagged line on her shoulder from a knife-wielding rustler in Oklahoma Territory. Each scar told a story, mapped a history she'd tried to leave behind. But now, with the Rawlins Gang breathing down her neck, those old wounds seemed to whisper warnings, reminding her of lessons learned in blood. A floorboard creaked beneath her feet as she dressed for the day ahead. Kneeling, she pried it up, revealing not just her peacemaker, but a wooden box she hadn't opened in 5 years. Inside lay the tangible remains of Swift Sally, a U.S. Marshal's badge, worn smooth at the edges from years of service, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, a daguerreotype of her standing with other peacekeepers outside the Yuma courthouse. "You promised yourself," she whispered, fingers hovering over the badge. "No more violence, no more death." But as she spoke, her hands moved with familiar precision, checking the peacemaker's action, cleaning the barrel with practiced ease. Some skills never fade, no matter how long they lie dormant. A knock at her door made her freeze. Through the window she saw Dr. Mitchell, his face grave in the early light. Quickly returning everything to its hiding place, she smoothed her nurse's apron and opened the door. "Sarah," he said without preamble, "we've got trouble. Rawlins' men visited the pharmacy last night. All our medicine orders have been canceled. They're cutting off our supplies." Her mind raced through implications. Without regular medicine deliveries, they'd be out of crucial supplies within weeks. No laudanum for pain, no quinine for fever, no digitalis for heart patients. They were attacking the hospital by targeting its most vulnerable point, its ability to heal. "There's more," Mitchell continued, following her inside. "The stage driver told me they've been asking questions about you, about your past, where you came from." Sarah's hand instinctively touched her hip where her gun should be. "What kind of questions?" "About Chicago, mostly. They seem mighty interested in your time there." He paused, studying her face. "Sarah, is there something you haven't told me? Something that might help us understand why they're focusing on you?" She turned away, busying herself with making coffee. "Everyone has a past, Doctor. Mine's not important right now. What matters is protecting our patients." But as she spoke, her eyes drifted to the loose floorboard. Beneath it lay not just a hidden gun, but a hidden truth. Swift Sally hadn't just been a peacekeeper, she'd been a legend. The kind of legend that made men like Rawlins nervous. If they discovered who she really was... "We need to start rationing medicines," she said, changing the subject. "Prioritize critical patients. And we should send someone to Carson City. They have a pharmacy that Rawlins' men can't reach easily." Mitchell nodded, accepting her deflection. "I'll make a list of what we need most urgently. But Sarah..." He hesitated. "If there's anything you're not telling me, anything that could help us..." "Doctor," she interrupted gently, "sometimes the past needs to stay buried, for everyone's safety." After he left, Sarah returned to the loose floorboard. The badge gleamed in the morning light, its star promising justice, but demanding a price she'd sworn never to pay again. Yet as she traced its outline, she remembered something her old mentor had told her. "A gun's just a tool, Sally. It's the hand that holds it and the heart that guides it that determines whether it brings justice or just more violence." Standing, she moved to her window, watching the town come to life. Somewhere out there, Rawlins and his men were planning their next move. They thought they were dealing with a simple nurse, someone they could bully and break. But as she watched the hospital's windows light up one by one, Sarah Cooper made a decision. She wouldn't become Swift Sally again. That path led only to more violence. But maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to use those old skills to protect without destroying, to bring justice without bloodshed. The morning sun caught a glint of metal beneath her floorboards, like a star winking in the darkness. Some secrets, Sarah knew, couldn't stay buried forever. The real question was, when they came to light, what kind of justice would they bring? Greater than. The new patient arrived just before noon, carried in by two ranch hands who'd found him half dead on the trail. Sarah's hands moved automatically, assessing injuries, broken ribs, severe dehydration, possible internal bleeding, but it was his face that made her pulse quicken. Weathered features she remembered from a courthouse in Yuma, 5 years and a lifetime ago. Marshal James Henderson had aged since she'd last seen him, his brown hair now streaked with gray, new lines carved deep around his eyes. He'd been unconscious when they brought him in, which was the only reason Sarah hadn't immediately fled Redemption Springs. "Bullet wound," she reported to Dr. Mitchell, keeping her voice professionally detached. "Left shoulder, at least 2 days old, signs of infection setting in." She didn't mention that she recognized the wound pattern as Rawlins's signature shot, high and left, meant to disable rather than kill. "Another victim of our unwelcome visitors, no doubt," Mitchell sighed, preparing to clean the wound. "Sarah, would you—" "I'll handle it," she interrupted, perhaps too quickly. "You're needed in the children's ward. Maria's fever is climbing again." Alone with Henderson, Sarah worked efficiently, cleaning and dressing his wound. Her mind raced through possibilities. If he woke and recognized her, 5 years of careful anonymity would evaporate in an instant. But she couldn't turn him away. Not only would it raise suspicions, but her oath as a nurse demanded she help. Water. Henderson's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes still closed. Sarah froze for a moment, then reached for a cup. "Here," she said softly, disguising her voice as best she could. "Drink slowly." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they fixed on her face. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Know you?" he mumbled, fighting through fever and laudanum. "From somewhere." "I'm Nurse Cooper," she said firmly. "You're in Redemption Springs Hospital. You've been shot and you're running a high fever. Try to rest." But Henderson's law enforcement instincts, honed over decades of service, weren't so easily dismissed. Even half-conscious, his eyes studied her face with uncomfortable intensity. Sally? The name was barely a whisper, but it hit Sarah like a physical blow. Swift Sally? They said you were dead. "You're delirious, Marshal," she replied, preparing another dose of laudanum. "The fever's making you confused?" "No." He tried to sit up, wincing at the pain. "Remember Yuma, the Carson brothers?" A coughing fit interrupted him, and Sarah used the opportunity to administer the medicine. "Rest now," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We can talk when you're stronger." As the laudanum took effect, Henderson's eyes grew heavy. "Followed Rawlins here," he muttered, fighting the drug's pull. "He's planning something big, more than just protection money." Sarah leaned closer, her nurse's gentle demeanor momentarily replaced by Swift Sally's intensity. "What's he planning, Marshal?" But Henderson was already drifting off, his last words barely audible. "The hospital. It's not about the money." Sarah straightened, her mind racing. If Rawlins's interest in the hospital went beyond simple extortion, it explained why he'd focused on them instead of the town's more profitable businesses. But what could a gang of outlaws want with a small frontier hospital? The answer hit her just as Jenny burst into the ward. "Miss Cooper, come quick! They're back!" Through the window, Sarah saw Rawlins and his men riding up to the hospital, their manner different this time, more purposeful, less theatrical. They were done playing games. She looked back at Henderson's unconscious form, knowing she faced an impossible choice. To protect her patients, she needed to face Rawlins. But now there was a man in her hospital who could expose her true identity the moment he regained consciousness. "Jenny," she said quickly, "stay with the marshal. He's not to have visitors, doctor's orders, and come get me immediately if he wakes." "But Miss Cooper, what about—" "I'll handle Rawlins," Sarah interrupted, already moving toward the door. As she walked down the corridor, her stride changed subtly, unconsciously shifting from a nurse's efficient pace to a gunfighter's measured step. The time for hiding was running out. One way or another, Sarah Cooper's careful masquerade was about to be tested, and Swift Sally's ghost was stirring beneath her nurse's uniform, ready or not. Greater than. While searching Henderson's belongings for identification, Sarah found a leather document case hidden in the lining of his coat. Her hands, steady during the most delicate nursing procedures, trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside lay a stack of letters, official dispatches, and wanted posters, a marshal's mobile office. One letter caught her eye immediately, dated just a week ago. "Jim, Rawlins Gang spotted moving north from Silver Creek. Patterns changed. They're targeting hospitals, pharmacies, anywhere that stores medicines, not just stealing supplies like common bandits. They're establishing control, building something bigger. Remember that morphine ring we broke up in '68? Same strategy, different players. P.S. reports of Swift Sally in Montana Territory. Probably nothing, but keep your eyes open. If anyone can unravel this, it's her." Sarah's blood ran cold. The morphine ring of '68 had been her first major case as a marshal, a network of corrupt doctors and outlaws controlling medical supplies across 3 territories, charging desperate people fortunes for basic medicines. They'd used hospitals as distribution points, forcing legitimate healers to either cooperate or close down. "Miss Cooper?" Jenny's voice made her jump. She quickly tucked the letters away. "Mr. Rawlins is asking for you. Says it's urgent." "Thank you, Jenny. Stay with the marshal. If he wakes, keep him calm and quiet." Sarah's mind raced as she walked to her office. The pieces were falling into place. Rawlins wasn't just another outlaw looking for easy money. He was building an empire on human suffering. In her office, she found not just Rawlins but Cole Turner as well, the big man's presence making the room feel suddenly smaller. Luke Hayes was notably absent. "Miss Cooper," Rawlins smiled, all forced charm, "I trust you've reconsidered our generous offer." "Actually, I have questions about your interest in our pharmaceutical supplies," Sarah replied, watching their reactions carefully. Both men stiffened slightly, a tell any experienced card player would recognize. "Just business concerns," Rawlins said smoothly, "ensuring proper security for valuable medicines." "Like you did in Silver Creek?" Sarah pressed. "Or Jefferson City? Or any of the other towns where hospitals mysteriously lost control of their supply lines?" The pretense of charm vanished from Rawlins's face. "You've been asking questions, Miss Cooper. Dangerous questions." "Someone has to, especially when people start dying because they can't afford basic medicines." Cole Turner moved slightly, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. Rawlins leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Let me be clear. By sunset tomorrow, you'll sign over control of the hospital's pharmaceutical supplies to our distribution company. Otherwise, accidents happen. Terrible accidents." "You mean like what happened to Marshall Henderson?" Sarah watched their faces carefully. "The lawman you shot and left for dead on the trail?" Rawlins' eyebrows rose slightly. "Marshall?" "Haven't seen any marshals lately, though if one did show up asking the wrong questions—" He left the threat hanging. "Get out," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made both men blink in surprise. "This is still my hospital." "For now," Rawlins stood, adjusting his gun belt meaningfully. "Remember, sunset tomorrow. Don't make us come back again, Miss Cooper. Next time won't be so pleasant." After they left, Sarah returned to Henderson's bedside. The marshal was still unconscious, but his fever had broken. On his bedside table lay the document case, and Sarah knew she had decisions to make. She could wake Henderson, reveal her identity, help him bring down Rawlins's operation legally. Swift Sally's badge still lay hidden under her floorboards, still carried legal authority. But that would mean leaving Redemption Springs, abandoning her new life, becoming again the person she'd tried so hard to leave behind. Or she could find another way, one that used both her old skills and new ones to protect her hospital and her patients. As if in answer to her thoughts, Henderson stirred, his hand reaching out to grab her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes opened, clearer now, fixing on her face with recognition. "Sally," he whispered, "they killed Doc Matthews in Silver Creek, burned him out when he wouldn't cooperate. Don't let them." He drifted off again, but his words had lit a fire in Sarah's chest. Doc Matthews had been the one who'd patched her up after the Yuma shootout, who'd inspired her to become a nurse. His death wouldn't go unanswered. Sarah Cooper might avoid violence, but Swift Sally had never let murderers walk free. Somehow, she had to find a way to be both, to save her hospital without sacrificing either side of herself. Greater than. Night had fallen by the time Sarah returned home, her mind heavy with the weight of Henderson's revelations. She lit a single lamp and knelt beside the loose floorboard, no longer hesitating as she lifted it away. The oiled cloth wrapping her peacemaker felt warm to her touch, like greeting an old friend. Unwrapping it carefully, she held the revolver up to the lamplight. The silver handle gleamed as bright as ever, its intricate engravings telling a story few had ever known. A rising phoenix on one side, the mark of special deputies authorized to work across territorial borders. On the other, a simple inscription, "To make things right, T.H." Thomas Hayes had given her the gun 15 years ago, when she'd first pinned on a badge. "A weapon's just a tool," he'd told her. "Like a scalpel, it's not about dealing death, it's about protecting life." The irony of those words wasn't lost on her now. Thomas Hayes had been Luke Hayes' father, a legendary lawman who'd died trying to keep his son from following a criminal path. Luke's presence in Rawlins Gang was no coincidence. He'd chosen the exact opposite of everything his father had stood for. Sarah checked the gun's action with practiced ease, muscle memory taking over. 6 chambers, all clean and ready. She had more ammunition hidden in a false bottom of her medicine chest. Another precaution from a life she'd tried to leave behind. "What would you do, Thomas?" she whispered to the empty room. Her old mentor had always preached patience, planning, and precision. "The same qualities that make a good doctor," he'd say, "make a good peace officer. Observe, diagnose, treat the cause, not just the symptoms." Rising, she moved to her desk and spread out Henderson's letters, building a picture of Rawlins' operation. 6 hospitals under their control already. Legitimate medicine supplies cut off, replaced by their own distribution network. Prices tripled, quadrupled. Basic medicines becoming luxury items that only the wealthy could afford. But it was more than just profit driving them. Rawlins was building an empire of addiction and desperation. Control the medicine, control the territory. It was brilliant in its cruelty. A soft knock at her back door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly covered the letters and moved to answer it, the peacemaker hidden but within reach. It was Jenny, her young face pale in the darkness. "Miss Cooper? The marshal's awake. He's asking for you by name." The girl's emphasis on the last words made Sarah's heart skip. "He called you Sally." Sarah's mind raced through options. "Did anyone else hear him?" "No, I made sure. But Miss Cooper, is it true? Are you really her? Swift Sally?" Looking at Jenny's face, young, earnest, frightened, but determined, Sarah made a decision. "Come inside," she said quietly. "There are things you need to know, about me, about Rawlins, about what's really happening to our hospital." As Jenny settled into a chair, Sarah poured them both coffee, adding a splash of whiskey from a hidden bottle. "What I'm about to tell you puts you in danger," she warned, "but I need help, and you've proven yourself trustworthy." She picked up the peacemaker, watching Jenny's eyes widen. "This gun has saved more lives than it's taken," she explained. "Just like a doctor's scalpel, it's not the tool that matters, but how you use it. I learned that lesson twice, first as a marshal, then as a nurse." Over the next hour, Sarah outlined everything, her past, Rawlins' true plans, the growing web of corruption and control. Jenny listened without interrupting, her expression changing from shock to understanding to determination. "They killed Doc Matthews," Sarah finished quietly. "A good man who taught me that healing isn't just about medicine, it's about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. I won't let them do that here." "What can I do to help?" Jenny asked, without hesitation. Sarah smiled, reminded suddenly of herself at that age, young, idealistic, ready to fight for what was right. "First, we need to get a message to Henderson's backup. He wouldn't have come alone. Then we need to prepare the hospital for what's coming." "And Rawlins?" "His deadline's tomorrow at sunset." Sarah's hand rested on the silver-handled revolver. "Rawlins thinks he's dealing with a simple nurse. By the time he learns differently, it'll be too late. But we're going to do this smart. No unnecessary violence. We protect the hospital, protect our patients, and bring him down legally if we can." "And if we can't?" Sarah's eyes hardened. "Then Swift Sally makes one last appearance. But this time, she's not just fighting for justice. She's fighting for healing." Greater than. Dawn painted the sky in shades of purple and gold as Sarah and Jenny prepared the hospital for what was coming. They worked systematically, combining Sarah's tactical knowledge with their medical expertise in ways that would have made Thomas Hayes proud. "Laudanum and morphine first," Sarah directed, helping Jenny move the most dangerous medicines to a hidden storage space behind a false panel in the supply room. "Rawlins wants control of these most of all. Without them, his whole operation falls apart." "Like cutting off a snake's head," Jenny observed, earning an approving nod from her mentor. "Exactly. But medicine can be more than just healing." Sarah pulled out several small bottles of ipecac and various harmless but potent-smelling compounds. Sometimes it's about strategy. They labeled these decoy bottles as valuable medicines, leaving them in obvious hiding places. The oldest trick in medicine, Sarah explained, make the poison look attractive and the cure look common. As they worked, Sarah shared more of her past, helping Jenny understand the full scope of what they faced. Rawlins isn't just a criminal, he's a businessman. He sees suffering as a commodity. Control the cure, control the people. Like they did in Silver Creek, Jenny asked, arranging clean bandages in easy-to-grab locations. Worse, in Silver Creek they just burned one doctor out. Here they're trying to take over the only hospital for 50 miles. Think about it. Every ranch hand, every miner, every family for days around would have to go through them for medical care. Thunder rumbled in the distance as they continued their preparations. A storm was moving in, perfect cover for what Sarah had planned. Marshal Henderson drifted in and out of consciousness, but in his lucid moments, he provided crucial information. "Backup's coming," he managed to tell Sarah during one such moment. "2 days behind me, Marshals Davies and Wilson." Sarah knew them both, good officers, but they'd arrived too late to prevent whatever Rawlins had planned for sunset. They'd have to handle this themselves. By mid-morning, the hospital had been subtly transformed. To unknowing eyes, nothing had changed. But Sarah had turned the building into a tactical advantage, using her knowledge of both medicine and combat. "Understand something," she told Jenny as they finished. "What I'm teaching you isn't just about fighting or healing. It's about protecting life. Sometimes that means bandages and medicine. Sometimes it means standing up to those who'd abuse them." They moved among the patients, quietly preparing those who could be moved. The children were relocated to the basement under the guise of a game, led by Jenny, who kept their spirits high with stories and songs. Sarah checked her hidden peacemaker one last time before returning to her duties. The storm grew closer, thunder now a constant rumble in the distance. It reminded her of the waiting before a gunfight, that same electric tension in the air. "Miss Cooper," little Maria called from her new bed in the basement, "Jenny says you're going to protect us from the bad men, like Swift Sally used to do." Sarah smoothed the girl's hair, sharing a knowing look with Jenny. "Sometimes the best way to fight bad men isn't with guns, Maria. Sometimes it's with smarts and medicine and good people standing together." But as another rumble of thunder shook the building, Sarah felt the weight of her peacemaker against her ribs. She'd tried to leave that life behind, to heal rather than harm. Yet here she was, preparing for another kind of healing, cutting out a cancer that threatened not just one patient, but an entire community. "Jenny," she called softly as they finished their preparations, "remember what I told you about Thomas Hayes? About a weapon being just a tool?" The young nurse nodded, checking the makeshift alarm systems they'd rigged throughout the building. "Well, a hospital can be a weapon too, in the right hands. Every room, every corridor, every medicine cabinet can either heal or harm. Today, we use everything we have to protect our patients. Everything." The storm was almost overhead now, thunder crashing like heaven's own judgment. Somewhere in town, Rawlins and his men were preparing their own plans for sunset. But they didn't know they were dealing with a woman who'd learned to fight with more than just bullets, a woman who understood that true strength comes in many forms. "They think they're facing one simple nurse," Sarah said, watching the storm clouds gather. "Instead, they're facing an entire hospital, and we've got more weapons than they can imagine." Greater than. The storm broke over Redemption Springs just after noon, bringing with it an unexpected gift: 3 new patients from a collapsed mining shaft. As Sarah treated their injuries, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. These weren't miners at all. Their hands were too soft, their injuries too superficial, and their eyes kept darting toward the medicine cabinet. "Broken ribs," she announced loudly for Jenny's benefit, wrapping one man's chest. "You'll need to stay still for at least a day." Her hands moved with professional efficiency, but she was buying time, studying their faces, memorizing details. "Right kind of you, ma'am," the supposed miner said, trying to sound grateful. But Sarah recognized the calculating look in his eyes. These were Rawlins' men, sent to infiltrate the hospital before sunset. "Jenny," she called, "would you prepare 3 beds in the East Ward?" The East Ward, furthest from their hidden medicines and closest to their prepared defenses. "And bring me the special compound for pain relief." Jenny's eyes met hers briefly, understanding. She returned with water bottles containing their prepared mixtures, harmless but fast-acting sleeping draughts mixed with mild ipecac, just enough to ensure these miners wouldn't cause trouble later. "Drink it all," Sarah instructed, her nurse's voice brooking no argument. "It'll help with the pain." As she worked, Sarah's mind categorized threats and advantages like she'd done in her martial days. 3 men inside now likely meant at least 3 more waiting outside. The storm provided cover for movement, but it worked both ways. Thunder would mask any sounds of approach. "Marshal," she whispered, during a quick check on Henderson. "Rawlins has men inside. How many should we expect total?" Henderson, still weak but clear-eyed, replied softly, 12 at least. He never works with less." Sarah nodded, adding this to her calculations. Through the window she watched another flash of lightning illuminate the street. No sign of Luke Hayes yet. He was probably their ace in the hole, waiting for sunset. "Miss Cooper?" one of the miners called out, his voice already slurring from the sleeping draft. "Feeling a mite queasy." "Common reaction to the medicine," she assured him professionally. "Just rest. It'll pass." Within an hour, all 3 men were sound asleep, their plans of causing chaos from inside thoroughly derailed. But Sarah knew this was just the opening move in a larger game. Dr. Mitchell arrived as the storm intensified, shaking rain from his coat. "Sarah, I've just heard. Rawlins's men were seen bringing in extra horses. They're gathering at the saloon." "Thank you, doctor, but I need you to leave." "Leave? But the patients—" "We'll be safer without you here," she interrupted gently. "Take the surgery records and prescription logs with you. Hide them somewhere safe. If anything happens to me, those books prove what Rawlins is really after." Mitchell studied her face, seeing something there he'd never noticed before. "Sarah, who are you really?" She smiled sadly. "Just a nurse, doctor, one who takes her duty to protect patients very seriously." She pressed the record books into his hands. "Now go, please." After he left, Sarah made her final rounds. Their legitimate patients were secure in the basement, comfortable and calm, thanks to Jenny's care. The 3 infiltrators were deeply asleep in the East Ward. Marshal Henderson was recovering well, his gun hand steady enough now to make him a valuable ally if needed. "Miss Cooper?" Jenny appeared at her elbow. "I've finished preparing the supplies you asked for." She held up a tray of innocent-looking medical items that Sarah had modified for very different purposes. Ammonia capsules that could become smoke screens, alcohol and bandages that could create quick diversions. Even the hospital's layout itself had been turned into a weapon with choke points and escape routes carefully planned. Sarah checked her pocket watch. 3 hours until sunset. Thunder crashed overhead as she made her decision. "Jenny, I need you to get a message to the telegraph office. Send this exactly as I say it. Patient presenting with severe complications. Recommend immediate intervention. Multiple practitioners required. Signed, Dr. S. Cooper." A message to the marshals? An old code. It'll tell them what they're riding into. Sarah moved to the window, watching lightning split the sky. "Now we wait. And Jenny, when things start happening, remember, you're not just a nurse anymore. You're a protector. Use everything I taught you, both kinds of knowledge." The storm raged on, providing cover for both sides to make their preparations. In 3 hours, Rawlins would learn the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the one wearing a gun. It's the one wearing a nurse's apron and carrying a lifetime of both healing and fighting in her hands. Greater than. The storm reached its peak an hour before sunset, rain drumming against the hospital windows like running horses. Sarah was checking the sleeping miners when she heard it, beneath the thunder, the distinctive sound of multiple riders approaching from different directions. "Jenny," she called softly, "positions." The young nurse moved quickly to her assigned post near the children's ward in the basement, carrying what looked like normal medical supplies, but were actually Sarah's carefully prepared defensive measures. They'd planned for this, prepared for it, but the reality of armed men surrounding a hospital still felt like a nightmare. Lightning flashed, illuminating mounted figures through the rain-streaked windows. Sarah counted 8 riders, plus the 3 inside, 11 total. One short of Henderson's count, which meant Luke Hayes was out there somewhere, holding back as she'd expected. Rawlins dismounted first, his long coat dark with rain. Cole Turner and 4 others accompanied him to the front door, while the rest spread out to cover the building's exits. Their efficiency confirmed Sarah's suspicion that they'd done this before, probably multiple times at other hospitals. The front door opened with a bang, letting in wind and rain along with the gunmen. Sarah met them in the front hall, every inch the professional nurse, despite the peacemaker hidden beneath her apron. "Mr. Rawlins," she said calmly, "this is a hospital. Please keep your voice down." "Not for long it ain't," Rawlins smiled, water dripping from his hat. "Sunset's coming, Miss Cooper. Time to discuss the new management arrangement." "My patients need attention," Sarah replied. "If you want to talk business, we can do it in my office." "Your patients?" Cole Turner laughed. "You mean like them 3 miners in the East Ward? Ain't heard a peep from them in hours?" "They're resting," Sarah said smoothly, "as injured men should be." "Resting?" Rawlins's eyes narrowed. "Or did you do something to them, Miss Cooper? Starting to think you ain't quite the simple nurse you pretend to be." Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, but her mind was racing. They were getting too close to the truth too quickly. She needed to redirect their attention. "I'm exactly what I appear to be, Mr. Rawlins, someone who takes care of the sick and injured, including, it seems, your men. Now, shall we discuss whatever business brings armed men to threaten a hospital?" Lightning crashed outside, and in that moment of brilliance, Sarah caught movement at the back of the group, Luke Hayes slipping in through the rain, looking troubled. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw recognition flicker across his face. Thomas Hayes had kept a photograph of Swift Sally on his desk, right next to the picture of his son. Luke would have seen it countless times growing up. "Thing is," Rawlins was saying, "we've got a proper doctor coming, someone who understands business better than old Mitchell. You can stay on as nurse if you cooperate. If not—" He gestured to his men, who were already moving toward the medicine storage room. "I wouldn't go in there," Sarah warned, her voice carrying an authority that made them hesitate. "We had a tuberculosis case this morning. The room needs to be properly fumigated before anyone enters." It was a lie, but a clever one. Even hardened gunmen feared consumption. The men looked uncertainly at Rawlins, who scowled. "You think you're clever, don't you? Playing these little games?" He drew his gun, pointing it at Sarah. "New terms. You show us where the real medicines are stored, or we start making examples of your patients, starting with them kids in the basement." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Sarah saw Luke Hayes flinch slightly at the mention of harming children. Like his father, it seemed he had some lines he wouldn't cross. "You really want to kill innocent people over medicine?" Sarah asked quietly. "Is that what you ride with now, Luke? Men who threaten children?" The use of his first name made Luke start. Rawlins turned sharply, looking between them. "You know her, Luke?" But before he could answer, a voice called down from upstairs. Marshal Henderson's voice, strong and clear. "I know her." And so do you, Rawlins. You just don't know it yet. The gang leader's face darkened with rage. "Search this place," he ordered. "Find those medicines, and somebody shut that lawman up permanent-like." As the men moved to obey, Sarah caught Jenny's eye across the hall. The young nurse nodded slightly. Their hidden patients were secure, the traps were set, and the real medicines were safe. Now they just had to survive until help arrived, or Rawlins forced their hand. Thunder shook the building as Sarah watched the gang spread out. Through her hospital. She'd tried to handle this peacefully, tried to be Sarah Cooper instead of Swift Sally. But as she watched armed men stalk through halls meant for healing, she knew that soon she'd have to be both, the healer and the fighter, the nurse and the legend. The storm raged on, counting down the minutes until sunset. Greater than. The first blood wasn't drawn by a bullet. One of Rawlins' men, searching the medicine storage room despite Sarah's warning, knocked over a shelf of glass bottles. The crash brought Sarah running, her nurse's instincts responding before her tactical mind could object. She found him on the floor, a deep gash in his arm where broken glass had sliced through flesh. Blood spread across the white linoleum, and for a moment everyone froze, outlaws and nurse alike. "Don't move," Sarah ordered, her voice carrying the same authority she'd once used to command deputies. "That glass likely hit an artery." The man, young and suddenly scared, nodded. His partners stepped back, uncertain. Even Rawlins, watching from the doorway, didn't interfere as Sarah knelt beside the wounded man. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, applying pressure while reaching for the medical supplies she always kept in her apron. This close, she could have easily ended the threat he posed, a subtle shift of pressure, a wrong placement of the tourniquet. Swift Sally would have considered it. But Sarah Cooper was a nurse first, and she hadn't spent 5 years healing people to start picking and choosing who deserved care. "Jenny," she called, knowing her assistant would be nearby, "I need a suture kit." The young nurse appeared with the required supplies, her face professional, but her eyes alert. As they worked together to save the man's arm, Sarah was acutely aware of the armed figures surrounding them. One wrong move could turn this scene of healing into bloodshed. "Why?" the wounded man whispered as she stitched his arm. "Why help me?" "Because that's what nurses do," Sarah replied simply. But her eyes met his, carrying a weight that made him look away. "We help people, even those who might wish us harm. Remember that, when whatever happens next happens." Rawlins watched the whole scene with calculating eyes. When Sarah finished bandaging the arm, he stepped forward, touching, real touching. "But time's running out, Miss Cooper. Sunset's coming, and we still haven't found what we're looking for." As if to punctuate his words, gunfire suddenly erupted from upstairs. Sarah's heart stopped. The second floor was where Marshal Henderson was recovering. "Got him!" a voice shouted. "The marshal was going for his gun." Sarah was moving before she could think, taking the stairs 2 at a time with Rawlins and his men close behind. She found Henderson on the floor, blood spreading across his chest, while one of Rawlins' men stood over him with a smoking gun. "He'll die without immediate surgery," Sarah said, already reaching for the wound. But Rawlins grabbed her arm. "Perfect. One less lawman to worry about." Sarah turned to face him, and something in her eyes made him step back. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Rawlins. This is my hospital. Under my roof, everyone gets care, even criminals, even murderers." Her voice carried steel beneath its professional calm. "So you can either let me save him, or you can shoot me too. But ask yourself, do you really want to add killing a nurse to your list of crimes?" Luke Hayes stepped forward. "Let her help him, Rawlins. Killing a marshal's one thing, letting him bleed out while a nurse begs to save him, that's something else." For a moment, the only sound was Henderson's labored breathing. Then Rawlins released Sarah's arm. "Fine, save him. But understand this, you've got until sunset to give us what we want, or he won't be the only one bleeding out." Sarah immediately went to work, her hands steady despite the tension. The bullet had missed the heart, but punctured a lung. Complex surgery, but she'd done worse in field hospitals during her marshal days. "Jenny," she called, knowing her assistant would appear as if by magic. "I need the surgical kit, and those special supplies we prepared earlier." Their eyes met briefly as Jenny handed over the instruments. Among them was a small package wrapped in clean bandages, Sarah's backup revolver, hidden in plain sight. As she worked to save Henderson's life, Sarah's mind raced through options. The shooting changed everything. Once word got out that Rawlins' gang had shot a marshal, every lawman in the territory would come hunting them, which meant they had nothing left to lose. Thunder crashed outside as Sarah's needle dipped in and out of flesh, suturing the wound. Her white apron was stained with blood, first from saving one of Rawlins' men, now from saving the marshal he had ordered killed. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. "Stay with me, Jim," she whispered to Henderson as she worked. "Help's coming. We just need to survive until sunset." But as she caught Rawlins' cold smile from the doorway, she knew surviving until sunset wasn't the real challenge. The real challenge would be surviving what happened after. Greater than. With Henderson stabilized but unconscious, Sarah took a moment to wash the blood from her hands. The familiar motion carried her back to another time, another place. Washing gunpowder residue from these same hands after the shootout in Yuma. The irony wasn't lost on her that both actions, healing and hurting, required the same careful cleaning afterward. "Miss Cooper?" Luke Hayes' voice came from the doorway. He stood alone, his expression troubled. "Could I have a word? Private-like?" Sarah dried her hands carefully, noting how he positioned himself away from the others, speaking low enough that Rawlins couldn't hear from down the hall. "Of course, Mr. Hayes." They moved to a quiet corner of the ward where the storm's rumbling would cover their conversation. Luke's hand kept straying to his gun belt, but his eyes held more uncertainty than threat. "You're her, ain't you?" he said finally. "Swift Sally, the one Pa used to talk about, the one he trained." Sarah studied Thomas Hayes's son, seeing echoes of her old mentor in his features. "Would it matter if I was?" "Pa kept your picture on his desk, right next to mine." Luke's voice caught slightly. "Said you were everything a peace officer should be. Smart, fast, but never cruel, never killing unless there was no choice. Your father was a good man, Luke. He'd be heartbroken to see you riding with Rawlins. You don't understand." Luke glanced nervously toward the door. "Rawlins, he's not just planning to take over the hospital. This is bigger. He's got men in every major town from here to Denver. Once he controls the medicine supply—" "He controls everything," Sarah finished. "Your father fought against men like that his whole life, died fighting them." "I know." Luke's hand finally settled on his gun butt. "That's why I'm warning you. Rawlins knows who you are. One of the boys recognized you from an old wanted poster. He's just waiting for sunset to make his move. Figures if he takes down Swift Sally, along with taking over the hospital, his reputation will be made." Sarah absorbed this news with outward calm, though her mind was already adjusting plans. "Why tell me this, Luke?" "Because Pa would want me to. Because—" he hesitated. "Because I've seen what Rawlins does to towns that resist, seen children die because their folks couldn't afford medicine. Even Pa wouldn't have wanted that." Before Sarah could respond, gunfire erupted from the front of the hospital. Not inside this time. It sounded like someone shooting at the building from the street. "Right on time," Luke muttered. "That'll be the rest of the gang arriving. Rawlins called in everybody for this one." Sarah was already moving, her nurse's stride unconsciously shifting to the balanced walk of a gunfighter. How many? 15 more at least. Some of the meanest hands in the territory. Luke caught her arm. "If you really are Swift Sally, now might be the time to prove it." Another volley of shots rang out, accompanied by the sound of breaking glass. From somewhere below came children's frightened cries. The basement wasn't as soundproof as they'd hoped. Sarah reached beneath her apron, feeling the reassuring weight of her hidden revolver. "Luke, get down to the basement. Help Jenny with the children. Whatever happens next, keep them safe." "What are you going to do?" Sarah's smile held no humor. "First, I'm going to remind Mr. Rawlins that shooting up a hospital is dangerous to everyone's health. Then—" Her hand moved to the hidden pocket where her marshal's badge lay wrapped in cloth. "Then I'm going to write a prescription for justice, one that's about 5 years overdue." As Luke hurried toward the basement, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in a window. The storm's lightning illuminated a face transformed, no longer just Sarah Cooper the nurse, but not quite Swift Sally either. She was something new, something that combined the best of both. "Time to make your rounds, Doctor," she whispered to herself, checking her weapon with practiced ease. Outside, more riders were arriving, their horses' hooves thundering like the storm above. Inside, a legend was awakening, armed not just with guns, but with 5 years of medical knowledge and a hospital full of unexpected weapons. Swift Sally was indeed returning. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting for healing itself. Greater than. Word spread through Redemption Springs like wildfire, despite the storm, or perhaps because of it, as townspeople huddled in shops and saloons, sharing what they'd seen. The shooting at the hospital had drawn crowds to windows and doorways, where they witnessed something none of them had expected. Old Sam Tucker, watching from his hardware store, was the first to make the connection. He'd been in Silver Creek during the Thompson Gang shootout, had seen Swift Sally in action. Now, watching Nurse Cooper move past the hospital windows with that same fluid grace, positioning patients and staff with tactical precision, recognition dawned. "Lord above," he whispered to his wife, "it's her, all this time." In the saloon, 3 cowboys who'd been treated by Sarah for various injuries traded stories they'd previously thought nothing of, how she always seemed to know when trouble was coming, how she positioned herself to watch doors and windows, how her hands never shook even during the most delicate procedures. Dr. Mitchell, taking shelter in the telegraph office, finally understood why his head nurse had been so insistent about certain changes to the hospital layout. She wasn't just being efficient, he told the telegraph operator, she was fortifying it. The operator, who had just finished sending Sarah's coded message, looked up sharply. "You mean the stories about her are true? Swift Sally didn't die in that Yuma shootout?" More gunfire erupted from the direction of the hospital, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Through the rain-streaked windows, townspeople could see Rawlins' men taking positions around the building, their numbers seeming to grow by the minute. Inside the hospital, Sarah was about to prove just how alive Swift Sally really was. She moved from window to window, staying low, cataloging threats and positions. 23 men total now, more than she'd ever faced at once, even in her peacekeeping days. "Jenny," she called softly, knowing her assistant would hear. "Status?" "Children are secure in the basement with Mr. Hayes," Jenny reported, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Marshal Henderson stable, but still unconscious, and—" she hesitated. "There's something you should know. People in town are talking. They know who you are." Sarah nodded grimly. "Can't be helped now. How are our supplies?" "Everything's ready, just like you planned." Through the window, Sarah caught glimpses of familiar faces in town, people she'd treated, lives she'd saved over the past 5 years. They weren't running or hiding. They were watching, waiting, as if expecting something extraordinary. "Miss Cooper?" It was Maria's father, appearing suddenly at the back door with several other men. "We've come to help. The whole town's talking about who you really are, about what you've done for people over the years, not just here, but before, as Swift Sally." Sarah studied their faces, ranchers, shopkeepers, miners, all of them patients or family of patients at some point, all of them armed. This isn't your fight, she warned. With respect, ma'am, Mr. Sanchez replied, it became our fight when they threatened our hospital. Swift Sally or Nurse Cooper, doesn't matter to us. You've helped our families. Now, let us help you. Before Sarah could respond, Rawlins's voice boomed from outside, amplified by the storm. Time's up, Sally. That's right, we know who you are. Sunset's coming early today. Come out now, or we start putting bullets through windows. Lots of patients in there, lots of innocent people. Their blood'll be on your hands. Sarah looked at the determined faces of the townspeople, then at Jenny, who stood ready with their medical supplies turned weapons. 5 years ago, Swift Sally would have faced this alone, trusting only in her gun and her reflexes. But she wasn't just Swift Sally anymore. Mr. Sanchez, she said quietly, get your men to the second floor. Jenny knows where the supplies are. We're not just going to fight them. We're going to make them regret ever threatening a hospital. As the townspeople moved into position, Sarah caught her reflection again. Her nurse's apron still bore bloodstains from saving lives, but now it concealed weapons meant to protect those same lives. She was both healer and fighter now, and for the first time she felt no conflict between the two. Outside, thunder crashed as Rawlins' men prepared for their assault. Inside, a legend reborn, prepared to teach them why threatening a hospital, her hospital, was the last mistake they'd ever make. Greater than. Lightning flashed as Sarah moved through her hospital with deadly grace, her mind working on 2 tracks at once. The nurse in her noted patient conditions, supply levels, and potential medical needs. The gunfighter assessed threats, positions, and tactical advantages. For the first time, she let both sides work in perfect harmony. Ammonia compounds here, she directed Jenny, placing modified medical supplies near the windows. When they break in, the fumes will disorient them without causing permanent damage. Swift Sally had once used smoke bombs for the same purpose, but Sarah Cooper's version was more elegant and came with the knowledge of exactly how to treat anyone accidentally exposed. Rawlins' men are moving into position, Luke reported from his window post. They're going to try all entrances at once. Sarah nodded, having expected this. Mr. Sanchez, have your men ready with those ether-soaked bandages. Remember, just like we practiced, don't let them catch fire, and don't breathe the fumes yourself. The townspeople had taken to her instructions with surprising efficiency. These men had spent years watching her work, trusting her medical judgment. That trust now extended to tactical matters as well. A bullet shattered another window, sending glass spraying across the floor. Sarah's response was instant and dual-natured, first ensuring no patients were injured, then noting the shooter's position from the angle of impact. They're getting bolder, Jenny observed, helping Sarah sweep up the dangerous shards. No, Sarah replied, her experienced eye catching subtle signs. They're getting nervous. Look at the shot pattern. Wild, uncontrolled. They expected us to surrender by now. The longer we hold out. A commotion from the front entrance interrupted her. Cole Turner's voice boomed through the halls. Last chance, Sally. Or should I say, Nurse Cooper. Come out now, or we start hurting folks. Sarah moved to a position where she could see Turner silhouetted in the doorway, flanked by 4 men. Her hand brushed the peacemaker under her apron, but she wasn't ready to reveal that card yet. Mr. Turner, she called, her voice carrying the professional calm she'd used on countless belligerent patients. I have men with severe injuries up here. Moving them would be dangerous. Surely we can discuss this like reasonable people? Reasonable? Turner laughed. Lady, reasonable went out the window when we found out who you really are. Rawlins ain't taking chances with Swift Sally. Then he should know what he's dealing with, Sarah replied, her voice hardening slightly. I've got patients to protect, Mr. Turner, people under my care. 5 years ago, I might have just shot you all and been done with it. But I'm a nurse now. I'd rather not add to the suffering in the world. Pretty words, Turner sneered, but words won't stop what's coming. Sarah's fingers traced the outline of her hidden badge. "No," she agreed softly. "They won't. Last chance, Cole. Take your men and ride out. There's been enough blood on my hands over the years. I don't want yours too." Turner's response was a bullet that whizzed past her head, embedding itself in the wall behind her. Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she mentally cataloged the shot's trajectory, Turner's stance, and the position of every man she could see. The nurse in her noted that his shooting hand trembled slightly, signs of nerve damage, probably from an old injury. The gunfighter knew exactly how to use that weakness. "Jenny," she called, without taking her eyes off Turner, "bring me my special kit, the black bag under the surgery table." The young nurse returned moments later with a worn leather bag that none of them had ever seen Sarah use. Inside was not medical equipment, but rather the tools of her former trade: ammunition, gun oil, and, most importantly, her marshal's badge. "Mr. Turner," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that made even hardened gunmen pause, "I've spent 5 years learning how to heal people, learning the value of life in ways I never understood as a marshal, so believe me when I say—" She pinned the badge to her blood-stained apron. "If you force me to choose between being a nurse and being Swift Sally, I'll be both. And that's more dangerous than either one alone." Thunder crashed overhead, as if emphasizing her words. In that moment, backlit by lightning, the assembled outlaws saw something unique, a legend reborn, but tempered by years of healing. Swift Sally's deadly skill, combined with Sarah Cooper's medical knowledge and compassion. And for the first time, several of Rawlins' men began to look genuinely afraid. Greater than. Dr. Mitchell's return to the hospital came at the worst possible moment, or perhaps, as Sarah would later reflect, the best. He burst through the back door just as Turner's men were regrouping for another push, his normally pristine coat soaked with rain and something else, something red. "They shot Ben Miller," he gasped as Sarah and Jenny rushed to help him. "The pharmacist from Carson City. He was bringing us emergency supplies. They ambushed him on the South Road." Sarah's hands moved automatically, checking the doctor for injuries. The blood wasn't his. "Where is he now?" "Hidden. Stable, I think. I did what I could, but—" Mitchell's voice trailed off as he finally registered the badge on Sarah's apron, the gun visible beneath it. "Good Lord. The rumors are true, then? You're really her?" "Later, doctor," Sarah cut him off. "What else did you find out?" Mitchell pulled a crumpled paper from his coat. "This was in Ben's saddlebags. It's worse than we thought, Sarah. Rawlins isn't just trying to control our medicines. He's replacing them with counterfeit drugs. Plaster pills painted to look like real medicine. They've been doing it all across the territory." Sarah took the document, scanning it quickly. Shipping manifestos, chemical formulas, lists of compromised pharmacies. "How many people have died from this?" "Dozens at least. Children, elderly, anyone who needed real medicine but got chalk and plaster instead." Mitchell's voice shook with rage. "They're not just criminals, they're murderers." A bullet smashed through the window above them, sending them all ducking for cover. Sarah moved with fluid grace, positioning herself between the doctor and the threat. "Get to the basement," she ordered. "Jenny, go with him." "And, doctor?" She caught his arm as he turned to go. "I'm sorry I never told you the truth about who I was, who I am." Mitchell studied her face, seeing his quiet head nurse and the legendary peace officer overlaid like a double exposure. All those suggestions about hospital security, the way you organized the wards, the extra supplies, ... Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You were preparing for something like this all along." "I was preparing for everything," Sarah admitted. "Old habits die hard." "Well, thank God they do." Mitchell squared his shoulders. "What do you need from me?" Before Sarah could answer, Luke Hayes appeared from the basement stairwell. "Rawlins is bringing up dynamite. They're going to try to blast their way in." Sarah's mind raced through options, combining both sets of her expertise. "Doctor, How much ether do we have in storage? 3 full cans. Why? His eyes widened as he understood. Sarah, that's incredibly dangerous. 1 spark dot. So is dynamite, she countered. But I know exactly how much ether vapor it takes to render a man unconscious, and more importantly, I know how to treat anyone who gets too strong a dose. The Hippocratic Oath, Mitchell began, says, first, do no harm, Sarah finished. But it doesn't say we can't defend ourselves and our patients. Sometimes, doctor, the best medicine is preventing worse harm from happening. Another volley of shots peppered the building. Through the windows they could see Rawlins' men positioning themselves for their final assault. The sun was touching the horizon. Official sunset was minutes away. I took an oath too, Sarah said quietly, checking her peacemaker one last time. As a marshal, I swore to protect the innocent. As a nurse, I swore to preserve life. Today, I'm keeping both promises. Mitchell looked at the badge on her bloody apron, then at the gun in her skilled hands. Finally, he looked at her face, the face of a woman who had spent 5 years healing his patients with the same dedication she'd once shown hunting criminals. What are your orders? He asked simply. Sarah Cooper, Swift Sally, smiled grimly. First, we're going to show them why you don't threaten a hospital. Then we're going to write up the biggest prescription for justice this territory has ever seen. Thunder crashed overhead as they moved to their positions, ready to defend their hospital with everything they had, medicine and bullets, healing and justice, mercy and steel. Greater than sunset painted the storm clouds blood red as Rawlins himself strode into the hospital's front hall, seemingly unconcerned about making himself a target. He carried a leather-bound ledger in one hand and his gun in the other. Found this in your office, Sally, he called out, his voice echoing through the corridors. Real interesting reading. You've been tracking our operation for months, haven't you? All those careful notes about medicine shipments, supply routes, mysterious deaths in other towns. Sarah watched from her hidden position on the upper floor, noting the strange confidence in his manner. He wasn't acting like a man about to lose everything. He was acting like someone about to win. 5 years of playing nurse, Rawlins continued, flipping through the ledger. 5 years of hiding from who you really are, and for what? So you could watch us build an empire right under your nose. An empire built on fake medicine and dead children, Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly, though he couldn't spot her location. Quite a legacy, Jack. Rawlins laughed, the sound ugly in the storm-darkened hall. Dead children? Lady, you ain't seen nothing yet. You think this is just about control and profit? This is about power, real power. He tossed the ledger aside, pulling something else from his coat, a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. You see this? 1 drop in a town's water supply, and suddenly everyone needs medicine. Medicine only we can provide. First the symptoms, then the cure, at our price. Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd seen something like this before, in her martial days, weapons disguised as medicine, used to hold entire communities hostage. Your fake medicines aren't just ineffective, she realized aloud. They're part of the poison, small doses, building up over time. Smart girl, Rawlins grinned. Always were, according to your reputation. The fake medicines keep people sick, dependent. And the real medicines, we control those too. A perfect system. Lightning flashed, illuminating more of his men entering the building. They carried not just guns now, but crates marked with pharmaceutical labels. Redemption Springs is just the start, Rawlins continued. This hospital, with its reputation for helping everyone, is perfect. Every ranch, every mining camp, every small town for 100 miles comes here for medicine. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. Sarah's mind raced. This wasn't just about profit anymore. It was biological warfare disguised as health care. Everything she'd fought against as a marshal and everything she'd sworn to prevent as a nurse combined into one monstrous scheme. "That's why you killed Doc Matthews in Silver Creek," she said, pieces falling into place. "He figured it out, didn't he? Old fool tested our medicines, started asking questions, had to make an example." Rawlins' voice hardened. "Just like we're going to make an example here. Sunset's almost here, Sally. Time to choose. Surrender the hospital and join us, or watch it burn with everyone inside." From her position, Sarah could see Jenny helping Dr. Mitchell prepare their makeshift defenses. She could hear Luke Hayes keeping the children calm in the basement. 5 years of healing, of building trust, of protecting lives. All of it had led to this moment. "You know what your mistake was, Jack?" she asked quietly, though her voice carried through the hall. "You thought Swift Sally was the dangerous one, the legend, the killer." She moved to where he could finally see her, badge gleaming on her blood-stained apron. "But Sarah Cooper? She's the one who spent 5 years learning exactly how the human body works, exactly what it can take, exactly how to help it heal or not." Rawlins's smile faltered slightly as he registered the absolute certainty in her voice. "A gunfighter might just shoot you," Sarah continued, her hand steady on her weapon. "But a nurse? A nurse knows 1,000 ways to stop a man without killing him, to leave him alive, but wishing he wasn't. Still want to find out which one I really am." Thunder crashed overhead as sunset approached, nature itself seeming to hold its breath for what would come next. In the basement, Marshal Henderson finally began to stir, regaining consciousness just in time for the final act of a drama 5 years in the making. Greater than. The first explosion rocked the hospital's east wing, just as the sun disappeared behind the storm clouds. Rawlins' men had finally deployed their dynamite, but Sarah was ready. The blast rattled windows and shook dust from the ceiling, but the reinforcements she'd secretly installed over the past 5 years held firm. "Now," she called, and Jenny triggered their first trap. Modified ether vapors, carefully contained and released through the ventilation system, filled the breach point. 2 of Rawlins' men dropped immediately, overcome by the anesthetic gas. A third staggered, firing wildly before collapsing. "Someone check on them," Rawlins ordered, but his men hesitated. They'd never faced an opponent who used medicine as a weapon. Sarah's voice carried through the smoke and chaos. "They'll live, if they get treatment within the next 10 minutes. Your choice, Jack." This was Swift Sally's tactical mind, combined with Sarah Cooper's medical knowledge. Every trap, every defense was designed to incapacitate without killing, but only she knew how to reverse the effects safely. "Damn you," Rawlins snarled. "Cole, take the south entrance. Luke, get up to the second floor." But Luke Hayes stood his ground. "No," he said quietly. "This ends here. Pa was right about you, about all of this." The betrayal sent Rawlins into a rage. He turned his gun on Luke, but Sarah was faster. Her first shot knocked the weapon from his hand with surgical precision, Swift Sally's accuracy guided by Sarah Cooper's knowledge of human anatomy. "That was your gun hand," she called out. "Specifically, the radial nerve cluster. Painful, but temporary, if treated properly." Rawlins clutched his numbed hand, face contorted with fury. "Kill them all!" he screamed to his remaining men. The hospital erupted into chaos. Gunfire thundered through the halls as Rawlins' gang mounted their final assault. But they weren't fighting just one legendary gunslinger anymore. They were facing a carefully coordinated defense led by someone who knew both combat and medicine. Mr. Sanchez and his men held the upper floors, using Sarah's modified medical supplies as weapons. Ammonia bombs disoriented attackers. Carefully measured doses of various compounds, delivered through improvised means, dropped men in their tracks. Jenny proved herself worthy of Sarah's training, moving through the chaos with a nurse's efficiency and a fighter's awareness. She coordinated the townspeople, directed the deployment of their medical weapons, and kept the patients safe. In the basement, Marshal Henderson had finally regained his feet. Though weak from his wounds, he positioned himself to protect the children, his badge and gun providing one last line of defense. Sarah moved like a ghost through her hospital, appearing wherever the fighting was thickest. Her every action was precisely calculated, a shot to disable rather than kill, a medical compound deployed to incapacitate rather than harm. She was both healer and fighter now, and more dangerous than either one alone. "You can still walk away from this," she called out to the remaining gang members. "Surrender now, and you'll receive proper medical treatment. Keep fighting, and whatever happens to you happens without a doctor's care." The threat hit home. These men had seen what their fake medicines did to people. The idea of facing similar suffering broke their resolve. One by one, guns clattered to the floor. Only Rawlins remained defiant. With his good hand, he smashed the vial of poison he'd shown earlier, letting the liquid splash across the floor. "Try healing this, Sally," he sneered. "One spark, and the fumes will kill everyone in the building." But Sarah just smiled grimly. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize that compound? I switched that vial an hour ago. All you've done is spill sugar water on my clean floor." The look of realization on Rawlins's face was almost worth 5 years of waiting. Almost. "It's over, Jack," Sarah said quietly, her gun trained on his heart with Swift Sally's deadliness, while Sarah Cooper's medical knowledge told her exactly where to aim for maximum effect with minimal risk of death. "Now, would you like me to treat that hand before the nerve damage becomes permanent, or should we discuss how many years you'll be spending in prison?" Thunder crashed one final time as justice and healing came together in perfect balance in the person of a woman who had learned to be both legend and healer. Greater than. The aftermath of the siege transformed the hospital into a strange mixture of medical ward and prison. Sarah moved from bed to bed, treating friend and foe alike with the same professional care. Her gun remained holstered but close at hand as she tended to Rawlins's nerve-damaged hand. "I should let it rot," she told him as she worked, her touch clinical but not cruel. "But unlike you, I take my oaths seriously." Rawlins watched her with a mixture of hatred and bewilderment. "Why bother? I tried to kill you, tried to destroy everything you built here." "Because that's what separates us," Sarah replied, finishing the bandage. "You saw medicine as a weapon. I saw that weapons sometimes need to serve medicine." She tightened the bandage just enough to make him wince. "Remember that during your long stay in prison." Marshal Henderson, though still weak, had taken charge of securing the prisoners. Luke Hayes proved invaluable, identifying key members of the organization and revealing the full scope of their operation. "The territorial governor will want to talk to you," Henderson told Sarah as she checked his wound. "Once word gets out about what happened here—" "Word won't get out," Sarah interrupted firmly. "Not the full story, anyway. Swift Sally needs to stay dead, Marshal. I've got patients who need Sarah Cooper." "And what about the ones who need both?" Jenny asked quietly, helping change Henderson's bandages. "The ones who need someone who can protect and heal?" Sarah paused, considering. The young nurse had proven herself extraordinary during the crisis, showing the same dedication to both healing and protecting that Sarah herself had discovered. "Maybe it's time for something new," Sarah said finally. "Not a legend, not just a nurse, but something in between, something that uses both sets of skills openly." Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, looking exhausted but determined. "The last of the wounded are stable, and Sarah, you should see this." He led them to his office where he'd been examining the contents of Rawlins' pharmaceutical crates. "These aren't just counterfeits. Some of these are real medicines, stolen from government shipments. Military-grade supplies, including—" He held up a familiar-looking vial. "This." Sarah took the vial carefully, recognizing the contents. "The poison they were using to make people sick. Now we can prove what they were doing." "More than that," Mitchell said. "We can create an antidote, help all the people they've poisoned in other towns." A commotion from the front of the hospital interrupted them. Sarah moved instantly, swift and silent, to investigate. But it was only Mr. Sanchez returning with news. "Riders coming," he reported. "Lots of them. But I think it's the law this time." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Henderson's backup was finally arriving, probably with territorial authorities in tow. Soon the hospital would be swarming with lawmen, all of them wanting to know exactly what had happened here. "Jenny," she called, making a decision. "Help me in surgery. There's something I need to do before they arrive." In the operating room, Sarah removed her marshal's badge and wrapped it carefully. "5 years ago, I buried Swift Sally because I thought I had to choose between fighting and healing. Today proved otherwise." "What will you do?" Jenny asked, understanding the moment's importance. "Keep the badge," Sarah replied, "but not the legend. From now on, I'm just Sarah Cooper, head nurse at Redemption Springs Hospital, a nurse who happens to be good with a gun when she needs to be." She smiled slightly. "And who's looking for an assistant who wants to learn both sets of skills." Jenny's eyes lit up with understanding. "You mean—" "I mean this hospital's going to offer a unique kind of protection from now on, one that uses medicine first but isn't afraid to use other methods when necessary." She handed Jenny the wrapped badge. "Keep this safe. Someday you might need it yourself." Through the windows they could see the approaching riders, their badges glinting in the aftermath of the storm. But Sarah wasn't worried anymore about her identity being discovered. She'd finally found a way to be both the healer and the protector, not as two separate people, but as one complete whole. "Now," she said, straightening her blood-stained apron, "let's go treat our patients, all of them, even the ones who tried to kill us." She checked her hidden gun one last time. "But let's keep the weapons handy, just in case. Some kinds of healing require both medicine and steel." Greater than. Territorial Marshal Davies was exactly as Sarah remembered him. Tall, methodical, and too clever by half. He studied the hospital's bullet-scarred walls with professional interest, while his deputies secured Rawlins and his men. "Impressive work," he commented, examining a cluster of shots that had disabled rather than killed. "These are Swift Sally's trademark patterns, non-lethal but extremely effective." "So I've heard," Sarah replied calmly, changing Marshal Henderson's bandages, "though I'm more concerned with treating the wounded than analyzing shot patterns." Davies watched her work, his eyes sharp. "Interesting thing about Swift Sally, she disappeared right around the time you showed up in Redemption Springs. And now here we are, with shooting that looks exactly like hers." "Marshal," Henderson interrupted from his bed, "Miss Cooper saved my life, twice. First with her surgical skills, then by defending this hospital. Does it matter who she might have been before?" "Suppose not," Davies admitted, "especially since officially Swift Sally died in that Yuma shootout. Be mighty inconvenient to explain how a dead woman helped us crack one of the biggest medical fraud cases in territorial history." Sarah kept her face professionally neutral, though she caught the hint of a wink from Davies. He was offering her a way to preserve both her past and her present. "What matters," she said carefully, "is that Rawlins' operation has been stopped. Those ledgers prove they were poisoning people deliberately, controlling medicine supplies across 3 territories. And the only casualties today were wounded, not dead," Davies noted, almost like someone knew exactly where to shoot to disable without killing. Someone with both medical knowledge and other skills. Before Sarah could respond, Jenny appeared with urgent news. "Miss Cooper, one of Rawlins' men is having a bad reaction to the ether." Sarah moved immediately, her nurse's instincts taking over. She found the man convulsing, his breathing shallow. Without hesitation, she began treatment, her hands sure and steady as she administered the correct counteragents. Davies watched her work, seeing how she combined medical expertise with the same precision she'd once used with a gun. "You know," he said quietly, "the territory could use someone with your particular set of skills, someone who understands both justice and healing." "I'm just a nurse, Marshal," Sarah replied, not looking up from her patient. "One who believes in protecting her hospital and her patients, whatever it takes." "Of course," Davies smiled. "Just a nurse, who happens to have 6 perfect disabling shots in her gun, each one placed exactly where it would stop an attacker without killing him. Medical knowledge put to interesting use." The patient stabilized under Sarah's care, his breathing returning to normal. As she straightened up, Davies added, "We'll need your testimony about the medical fraud aspects of this case. Nothing more. Swift Sally can stay dead as far as the official record goes." "And unofficially?" "Unofficially, I'm glad to know there's someone in this territory who can heal with one hand and protect with the other. These are rough times. We need more people who understand both sides of justice." Sarah studied the marshal's face, seeing the same practical wisdom she'd known years ago. "The hospital comes first," she said firmly, "but if you ever need someone who understands both medicine and other matters, I'll know where to find you." Davies tipped his hat, "though I suspect plenty of folks already do, judging by how the townspeople rallied to help you." As if to prove his point, Mr. Sanchez appeared with fresh bandages and a subtle nod toward the door. More riders approaching, probably more law enforcement. "Back to work," Sarah said, readying her medical supplies. "Unless you need anything else, Marshal." "No, Miss Cooper, or whoever you are. I think justice has been well served today, both kinds." He turned to leave, then paused. "Though I would like to know one thing. Those medical traps you set, that was inspired. Where'd you learn to use medicine that way?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Let's just say I had a lot of time to think about how healing and hurting are sometimes 2 sides of the same coin. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients to tend to." The marshal nodded, understanding. As he left to process the prisoners, Sarah returned to her rounds, comfortable at last in being both healer and protector. The weight of her hidden gun balanced perfectly with the medical instruments in her pockets. Tools of both trades, serving the same purpose. Greater than. Night fell over Redemption Springs like a heavy blanket, bringing with it new tensions. Most of Rawlins' captured men had been transported to the territorial jail, but 6 of the most seriously wounded remained under guard at the hospital. Sarah knew from experience that wounded outlaws were often the most dangerous, like trapped wolves, desperate and unpredictable. 2-hour rotation on the watch, she instructed Jenny, checking the restraints on a particularly troublesome patient. "And remember what I taught you about checking for hidden weapons during bandage changes." "Already found 3 knives and a derringer," Jenny reported proudly, holding up the confiscated weapons. "Amazing how many hiding places there are in a hospital bed." Sarah smiled, remembering how she'd once hidden her own backup gun in a similar bed during the Yuma incident. People never change, just their methods. Speaking of which... She nodded toward the end of the ward where Luke Hayes sat under loose guard, his status somewhere between prisoner and ally. "What'll happen to him?" Jenny asked softly. "That depends on Marshal Davies and the territorial judge." Sarah approached Luke, noting how he sat with his father's straight-back dignity, despite his circumstances. "How's the arm?" "Healing clean," he replied, touching the bandage where one of Sarah's precisely placed shots had disabled him during the fight. "Just like Pa always said about you, you never hurt anyone more than necessary to stop them." A commotion from the street interrupted them, horses approaching at speed. Sarah moved to the window, her hand automatically checking her hidden holster, but it was only a regular patrol of deputies making their rounds. "Town still stirred up," Luke observed. "Word spreading about what Rawlins was really doing." "About the poisoned medicines." Sarah nodded grimly. They'd spent the afternoon cataloging the evidence, hundreds of counterfeit pills, tainted medicines, and detailed records of their distribution. The death toll would take months to fully calculate. "Miss Cooper," one of the younger nurses called urgently from the next ward, "Jackson's having another seizure." Sarah moved swiftly to where the wounded outlaw thrashed against his restraints. This was the dangerous part, treating men who'd tried to kill her hours before, who might try again if given the chance. But she'd meant what she said about taking her oaths seriously. As she worked to stabilize Jackson, she felt the weight of her gun against her ribs, comfortable now, rather than contradictory. The same hands that could heal could also protect that healing. She wasn't choosing between Sarah Cooper and Swift Sally anymore. She was finally both, and stronger for it. "Why?" Jackson gasped when the seizure passed. "Why help us after what we tried to do?" "Because that's what healing means," Sarah replied, adjusting his medication. "Justice doesn't always have to come from the barrel of a gun." Later, checking on Marshall Henderson's recovery, Sarah found him deep in conversation with Jenny. The young nurse was asking detailed questions about law enforcement techniques while taking careful notes in what looked suspiciously like a medical textbook. "Following in my footsteps?" Sarah asked, amused. "Learning from both sides of you," Jenny replied without embarrassment. "You've proved we don't have to choose between healing and protecting. Why not learn to do both properly?" A sharp whistle from outside, the prearranged signal from Mr. Sanchez that more riders were approaching. Sarah tensed until the second whistle followed, indicating friendlies. Probably more law enforcement coming to take statements about Rawlins' operation. "They'll be asking questions for weeks," Henderson predicted. "This case will shake the whole territory. A lot of powerful people involved in that medicine racket." "Let them ask," Sarah said calmly, checking his bandages. "Sarah Cooper, head nurse, will tell them about the medical fraud she discovered. Swift Sally's part in this can stay in the shadows where it belongs." "And if more trouble comes?" Jenny asked. Sarah smiled, patting both her medical bag and her hidden gun. "Then they'll find this hospital is still very well protected, by whatever means necessary." The night deepened outside, but for the first time in 5 years, Sarah felt completely at peace with who she was. The legend of Swift Sally hadn't died. It had evolved into something more complete, something that could both heal and protect. Greater than. Dawn brought a steady stream of townspeople to the hospital, officially coming to check on family members or deliver supplies, but really coming to see the woman they'd known as Sarah Cooper in a new light. She handled their curiosity with gentle professionalism, neither confirming nor denying the rumors now circulating about her true identity. "Just doing what needed to be done," she told Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd brought fresh bandages and wide-eyed questions about the shooting. "Same as I've always done." But word was spreading beyond just Swift Sally's identity. Stories about Rawlins' poisoned medicines had reached neighboring towns, and desperate people began arriving, seeking help for family members who'd been sickened by the counterfeit drugs. "We'll need to expand the ward," Sarah told Dr. Mitchell, as they examined a young girl showing all the signs of Rawlins's poison. "And send word to other doctors about the antidote we've developed." "Already done," Mitchell replied. "But these people aren't just coming for medicine, Sarah. They're coming because they've heard this hospital is protected by someone who understands both healing and justice." As if to prove his point, 3 rough-looking men arrived at the door, guns visible on their hips. Sarah tensed, but Jenny was already moving to her position covering the entrance, medical bag in hand, the same bag Sarah had taught her to modify for defensive purposes. "Help you, gentlemen?" Sarah asked calmly, noting their stance, their weapons, their nervous energy. "Our boss," the leader said gruffly, "been sick 3 months. Doctors in Carson City couldn't help. Heard you folks figured out about them bad medicines." Sarah studied them carefully. "Your boss wouldn't happen to be James Trigger Wilson, would he?" "The one running guns up near the Montana border?" The men stiffened. "You know him?" "Swift Sally had some dealings with him years back," Sarah replied evenly. "He was fair in his way. Never hurt innocent people. Tell him Sarah Cooper will treat him. Under 2 conditions. He comes alone, and he comes unarmed." The men exchanged glances. You really her? Swift Sally. I'm a nurse who's good at protecting her patients. That's all anyone needs to know. Her hand didn't move toward her hidden gun, but something in her stance made the men step back slightly. Your boss needs medicine, not guns. Make sure he understands that. After they left, Jenny approached with a question in her eyes. You're going to treat him, a known criminal? I'm going to treat a sick man, Sarah corrected, same as anyone else, but I'm going to be smart about it. She checked her hidden holster. Mercy and lead, Jenny. Sometimes you need both. Throughout the day, more people arrived, sick folks, scared folks, and more than a few hard cases testing the waters. Sarah handled them all the same way, with a nurse's compassion, backed by a gunfighter's awareness. Marshal Henderson, watching from his recovery bed, nodded approvingly. You've found your balance, he observed, not just playing one role or the other anymore. The hospital comes first, Sarah replied, changing his bandages, but I won't pretend I don't know how to protect it anymore, or how to use that knowledge to help people. As evening approached, Dr. Mitchell called a staff meeting. The hospital's reputation was growing, he explained. They needed to be prepared for more patients, more challenges, and, yes, more threats. Anyone who wants to transfer to a quieter hospital, I'll arrange it, he finished. What we're doing here? It's not what any of us trained for. But not a single nurse or orderly stepped forward. Instead, they looked to Sarah, waiting for her lead. We're still healers, she told them. That hasn't changed. We just understand now that sometimes healing means protecting too. Anyone who wants to learn both, I'll teach you. Anyone who doesn't, that's fine too. This hospital has room for all kinds of healing. The staff nodded, understanding. They'd seen firsthand how Sarah's dual skills had saved not just the hospital, but countless lives. She wasn't just a legend or just a nurse anymore. She was something new, something necessary for these dangerous times. And looking at Jenny's determined face, Sarah knew she wouldn't be the last of her kind. Greater than. The first test of Sarah's new role came sooner than expected. Just before dawn, Trigger Wilson arrived at the hospital, honoring her conditions by coming alone and unarmed. What nobody expected was the group of bounty hunters who'd been tracking him. Sarah was checking his symptoms, clear signs of Rawlins' poison, when the first shot shattered the pre-dawn quiet. The bullet hole in the window was followed by a gruff voice. Wilson, come out or we burn the place down. 5 men, Wilson reported professionally, already looking for cover. Been following me 3 days. Guess they figured a sick man was easy prey. Sarah moved with swift efficiency, helping her patient behind a heavy cabinet. Jenny, she called, knowing her assistant would appear instantly. Code blue. It was their new signal, established just the day before. Within moments, Jenny had the other patients secured while Sarah retrieved her medical bag, the one now modified to hold both healing supplies and defensive tools. Mr. Wilson, Sarah said calmly, checking her hidden gun, I promised you treatment under 2 conditions. Now, I need something from you. Your word that what happens next stays between us. Wilson studied her face, understanding dawning in his eyes. So the stories are true. You really are her. I'm a nurse protecting her hospital, Sarah replied. That's all anyone needs to know. She turned to Jenny. Get Dr. Mitchell. Our patient's going to need that antidote soon, and I'm going to be busy explaining hospital policy to some uninvited visitors. Sarah moved through the pre-dawn shadows of her hospital with practiced ease. Through the windows, she could see the bounty hunters spreading out, preparing to rush the building. They clearly hadn't heard about recent events in Redemption Springs. Gentlemen, she called out, her voice carrying the authority of both her professions. This is a hospital. We have sick patients here, including children. Whatever business you have with Mr. Wilson can wait until he's treated. Lady, you don't understand who you're harboring, their leader shouted back. That man's worth $500 dead or alive. And my patients' lives are worth more than your bounty, Sarah replied. You have one chance to leave peacefully. After that, you'll need medical attention yourselves." Their response was another shot, this one deliberately close to where she stood. Sarah shook her head sadly. Some people never learned. What happened next would be talked about in Redemption Springs for years to come. Sarah Cooper, respected nurse, emerged onto the hospital's front porch with both her medical bag and Swift Sally's legendary speed. 5 shots rang out in rapid succession, none killing, but each finding its mark with surgical precision. Within moments, all 5 bounty hunters were on the ground, each with a carefully placed wound that would require medical attention but leave no permanent damage. Sarah approached them, now fully in her nurse's role again. "Looks like you gentlemen will need treatment," she said professionally. "Fortunately, you're already at a hospital. Jenny, bring the admission forms." As she worked to tend their wounds, the bounty hunters watched her with a mixture of fear and awe. "Who are you?" one finally asked. "I'm the head nurse at Redemption Springs Hospital," she replied simply. "A hospital that treats everyone, law-abiding citizens, outlaws, and foolish bounty hunters alike. But we do have one strict rule." She finished bandaging his arm, her touch professional but firm. "No one threatens our patients, ever." By the time Marshal Davies arrived to investigate the disturbance, Sarah was deep in treating both Wilson and his would-be captors. The marshal took in the scene, 5 notorious bounty hunters being patched up by the woman who'd shot them, and simply tipped his hat. "Nice shooting, Nurse Cooper," he said with a slight smile. "Very precise." "Just doing my job, Marshal," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Both of them." Greater than. Marshal Davies returned to Redemption Springs a week after the bounty hunter incident, bringing news that made Sarah's dual role even more crucial. He found her in surgery, performing a delicate procedure on one of Rawlins' poison victims. "Territorial governor's taken a personal interest in this case," he reported once she'd finished. "Rawlins' operation went deeper than anyone imagined. 3 judges, 2 mayors, and half a dozen lawmen were on his payroll." Sarah cleaned her surgical instruments with practiced care. "Not surprising. You can't run an operation that size without official protection." "No," Davies agreed, watching her methodical movements. "But here's what's interesting. Every one of those corrupt officials had a connection to the old Yuma case, the one where Swift Sally supposedly died." Sarah's hands paused briefly. "That was 5 years ago, Marshal. 5 years of building a poisoned medicine empire, 5 years of killing innocent people for profit, 5 years that might have been prevented if Swift Sally hadn't disappeared." His words carried no accusation, just fact. "And what would you have had her do?" Sarah asked quietly. "Keep killing until there was nothing left but the legend?" "No," Davies smiled slightly. "I'd have her do exactly what you're doing now, fighting corruption with both healing and justice. The governor's creating a new division, medical investigators with full law enforcement authority, people who understand both sides of this fight." Sarah set down her instruments, finally meeting his eyes. "I'm not interested in wearing a badge again, Marshal. Not asking you to. Officially, you'll be a medical consultant, helping us track counterfeit medicines and training others to spot them. Unofficially," he shrugged. "Well, Redemption Springs Hospital seems to have developed quite a reputation for handling trouble in its own unique way." Before Sarah could respond, Jenny rushed in. "Miss Cooper, Luke Hayes just brought in 3 men from the Carson City mining camp, all showing signs of Rawlins' poison." Sarah moved immediately, professional mask back in place. "Prepare the new ward and get Dr. Mitchell. Marshal, if you'll excuse me." "Actually," Davies followed her, "this is exactly what I'm talking about. These men need both kinds of help, medical treatment and justice for those who poisoned them. You're uniquely qualified to provide both." The new ward was already filling with similar cases, miners, ranchers, travelers, all victims of Rawlins' counterfeit medicine operation. Luke Hayes, still under loose supervision while awaiting trial, had taken to bringing in victims he discovered during his supervised rides. "The territory's going to need a network," Davies continued as they worked. "People who can identify these cases, treat the victims, and help us track down the remaining distributors. People with your particular set of skills." Sarah checked a miner's pupils, noting the distinctive signs of the poison. "And you think I should help build this network?" "I think you already are," Davies gestured to Jenny, efficiently organizing supplies while keeping one eye on potential threats. "You're training the next generation to be both healers and protectors. Why not make it official?" Sarah thought about the changes in her hospital over the past week. Her staff had adapted quickly to their new dual role, learning to spot threats while providing care. Even Dr. Mitchell had started carrying a derringer in his medical bag. "Purely for medicinal purposes," he claimed with a wink. "No badge," she said finally. "No official position. I'm a nurse first and foremost." "But—" She met Davies' eyes. "If you need someone to train your medical investigators, show them how to balance both sides of the job, I might know someone who can help." Davies smiled. "I thought you might." "And Sarah." He touched the brim of his hat. "It's good to have you back. Both sides of you." As the marshal left, Sarah watched Jenny teaching a new nurse how to check patients for hidden weapons during examinations. The young woman had taken to her dual training naturally, showing the same dedication to both healing and protecting that Sarah had discovered in herself. Maybe Davies was right. Maybe it was time to build something new, not a return of Swift Sally, but a new kind of protector, someone who could heal with medicine or lead, whatever the situation required. Greater than. The transformation of Redemption Springs happened so gradually that most people barely noticed it happening. The changes were subtle at first. Townspeople began bringing information along with their ailments to Sarah, sharing whispered warnings about suspicious medicines or troublesome strangers. The saloon keeper started sending his bouncer to train as an orderly, understanding that the hospital sometimes needed muscle as much as medicine. The blacksmith's wife, a retired schoolteacher, offered to teach basic nursing skills to anyone willing to learn, creating a pool of capable helpers for both emergencies and everyday care. "It's becoming something special," Jenny observed one morning as she watched 3 ranch hands practicing both bandaging techniques and defensive positions. "Not just a hospital anymore, more like a sanctuary," Sarah finished, checking supplies in her modified medical bag. "A place where people can find whatever kind of healing they need." The morning brought its usual mix of patients, a cowboy with a broken arm, a farmer's wife with fever, and a hard-eyed stranger who Sarah immediately recognized as one of Marshal Davies's new medical investigators, sent to learn her methods. Nurse Cooper, the woman introduced herself as Catherine Wells. "The marshal said you could teach me how to spot counterfeit medicines." "Among other things," Sarah replied, noting how the woman carried both a doctor's bag and a well-worn gun belt. "Let's start with today's rounds." As they worked, Sarah shared the knowledge she'd gained from both her lives. She showed Catherine how to identify fake medicines not just by their appearance, but by the subtle signs in patients who'd taken them. She demonstrated how to turn a simple medical examination into a security assessment and how to handle trouble without compromising care. "The trick," Sarah explained while treating a miner's cough, "is to never forget that you're a healer first. The other skills are just tools to protect that healing." Word of Redemption Springs' unique hospital had spread far beyond the territory now. People came from hundreds of miles away, some seeking treatment for Rawlins poisons, others looking for the kind of protection that only Sarah's dual expertise could provide. "Got 3 more coming in from the Dakota Territory," Mr. Sanchez reported that afternoon. "Families poisoned by bad medicine, and 2 more of Marshal Davies' people wanting training." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. The network Davies had proposed was growing naturally, built on trust and necessity rather than official authority. Every person she trained carried her methods back to their own communities, spreading both healing and protection across the frontier. The town itself had embraced its new identity. The hospital's expanded security needs were met by volunteers from every walk of life. Shopkeepers, ranchers, even the local sheriff's deputies took turns standing watch. But they did it Sarah's way, wearing medical aprons over their gun belts, ready to help with both healing and defending. That evening, as Sarah checked on her patients one last time, she found Luke Hayes teaching a young deputy how to properly secure a wounded prisoner without compromising their treatment. The former outlaw had found his own kind of redemption in helping others find theirs. "Never thought I'd be on this side of things," he admitted when she stopped to check his work. "Pa would be proud, though, wouldn't he? Helping people like this?" "He would," Sarah agreed. "Just like he'd be proud of how the whole town's come together." From her office window she could see the sunset, painting the town in shades of gold. Redemption Springs had lived up to its name, becoming a place where both bodies and souls could heal, where justice and mercy worked hand in hand. The legend of Swift Sally might have died in Yuma, but something better had been born in its place, a community dedicated to protecting healing itself, led by a woman who had finally found a way to be both the person she'd been and the person she'd become. Greater than. Late one night, after a particularly challenging day of balancing both sides of her role, Sarah found herself alone in her office, examining her old marshal's badge. The silver star had tarnished slightly during its years hidden beneath her floorboards, much like her own past had dulled, but never truly faded. "Miss Cooper?" Jenny's voice interrupted her contemplation. The young nurse entered, carrying a familiar-looking leather case. "Marshal Henderson left this for you before he headed back to Yuma." Inside the case, Sarah found newspaper clippings, 5 years' worth of stories about deaths from counterfeit medicines, corrupted officials, and communities terrorized by men like Rawlins. The unspoken message was clear. While she'd been hiding, people had suffered. "You couldn't have stopped all of it," Jenny said softly, reading her expression. "Even Swift Sally had her limits." "Maybe," Sarah replied, touching a headline about a children's ward devastated by fake medicines. "But I could have done more than hide." "You weren't hiding," Dr. Mitchell's voice came from the doorway. He entered carrying his own collection of papers, medical records from their hospital over the past 5 years. "You were healing, learning, becoming something more than just a legend with a gun." Sarah spread the papers across her desk, death notices on one side, records of lives saved on the other, the balance of her 2 lives laid out in black and white. "I've been thinking about what Marshal Davies said," she admitted, "about training others to do what we do here, not just medical investigators, but anyone willing to learn both sides of healing." "Like me?" Jenny asked hopefully. Sarah smiled at her protege. "You're already doing it. Ever since the siege, you've shown that same balance, knowing when to heal and when to protect. Sometimes they're the same thing." A commotion from the ward interrupted them, raised voices, the sound of breaking glass. They rushed out to find one of their recovering patients, a former Rawlins Gang member, in the grip of a poison-induced seizure. He'd knocked over a medicine tray and now lay thrashing among broken glass and spilled laudanum. Sarah moved without hesitation, but her response combined both aspects of her training. She secured the patient with Swift Sally's efficient movements, while Sarah Cooper's medical knowledge guided her treatment. Jenny worked alongside her, matching her dual approach perfectly. "You see," Dr. Mitchell observed, once the crisis had passed. "That's what you've built here. Not just a hospital that can defend itself, but a new way of thinking about healing altogether." Sarah cleaned the patient's fresh cuts, remembering other wounds she'd treated and caused over the years. "It comes with a price," she said quietly. being both healer and protector. Sometimes the choices aren't clean." "Life isn't clean," Mitchell replied. "That's why we need people who understand both sides of it. People like you, like Jenny's becoming." As if to emphasize his point, they heard horses approaching the hospital. Sarah tensed automatically, but Jenny was already moving to check, her medical bag in one hand, her other near the small derringer Sarah had taught her to carry. "Just Mr. Sanchez," she reported, bringing in a ranch hand with snakebite and word about some suspicious medicine peddlers heading this way. Sarah nodded, already preparing both anti-venom and her hidden gun. The weight of both responsibilities settled on her shoulders, no longer a burden, but a balance she'd finally learned to carry. "You know what Thomas Hayes used to say?" she asked, remembering her old mentor. "He said a weapon's just a tool. It's the hand that holds it that matters." Same is true for medicine, I suppose, or badges, or any kind of healing. She looked at her assembled staff, doctor, nurses, and volunteers who'd learned to be both healers and protectors. None of them would ever be Swift Sally, but they'd become something just as important. People who understood that sometimes the greatest healing comes from being strong enough to protect it. Greater than. The letter from Carson City's new hospital arrived on a crisp autumn morning, 6 months after the Rawlins incident. It was just one of many such letters now arriving at Redemption Springs, each asking for guidance in establishing what people had started calling the Cooper method, a combination of medical care and protective measures that was transforming frontier health care. 3 more requests for training, Jenny reported, sorting through the morning mail. And Marshall Davies says the Medical Investigation Unit has already uncovered 2 more counterfeit medicine operations. Sarah smiled, watching her former assistant, now full partner, organize the day's work. Jenny had grown into her dual role beautifully, helping to train others in both the healing and protective arts. "Dr. Mitchell wants to talk to you about expanding again," Jenny continued. "We're getting more students than we can handle." The hospital's training program had evolved far beyond Sarah's initial expectations. What had started as informal lessons in combining medical care with self-defense had become a structured curriculum. Nurses learned to spot signs of danger while treating patients. Lawmen learned basic medical skills to complement their protective duties. Even ordinary citizens came to learn how to better protect their community's health. "Miss Cooper?" A young woman in a nurse's uniform appeared at the door. Catherine Wells, the medical investigator Sarah had trained months ago. "Got something you need to see?" Catherine laid out a series of reports on Sarah's desk. They showed a pattern of healing across the territory, communities where the Cooper method had taken root, showing dramatically lower rates of medicine-related deaths and violent incidents. "It's not just about stopping bad medicine anymore," Catherine explained. "These towns are learning to protect themselves in all sorts of ways. Medicine, security, community support, it's all connected just like you taught us." Sarah studied the reports, remembering how Swift Sally had once measured success by the number of outlaws brought to justice. Now she measured it in lives saved, communities strengthened, and healing protected. A commotion from the street drew their attention. A group of riders was approaching, not threats this time, but a delegation from a nearby mining town seeking help with a suspicious outbreak of illness. "Jenny," Sarah called, but her partner was already moving, medical bag in hand, protective gear subtly in place. They worked in seamless tandem now, each understanding both sides of their calling. As they prepared to ride out, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The youngest member of the mining town delegation was watching them with familiar eyes, Thomas Hayes's eyes. Luke's daughter, she realized, sent to learn from the woman who'd helped her father find his own redemption. "You want to learn medicine?" she asked the girl. "And the other stuff?" the young Hayes replied firmly. "Pa says you teach both, says it's what Grandpa would have wanted, healing that knows how to protect itself." Sarah shared a look with Jenny, seeing her own journey reflected in this next generation. Swift Sally's legend had faded, but something more important had grown in its place, a legacy of healing that understood the importance of strength, of protection, of standing guard over the vulnerable. "First lesson," Sarah told the girl as they mounted up, "a healer's hands can do more than just bandage wounds. They can prevent them, stop them before they happen. But for that, you need to learn to see with both sets of eyes, the healers and the protectors." As they rode toward the mining town, Sarah felt the weight of her hidden gun balanced perfectly with her medical bag. She wasn't Swift Sally anymore, and she wasn't just Sarah Cooper either. She was something new, something necessary for these changing times, a healer who understood that sometimes the greatest medicine was the strength to protect it. Behind them, Redemption Springs Hospital stood as a beacon of this new way, not just a place of healing, but a fortress, protecting that healing, staffed by people who understood both the gentle and the fierce arts of preserving life. Greater than. 1 year to the day after the Rawlins siege, Sarah stood on the hospital's porch watching the sunset. The building had grown, just like its mission, new wings for training, expanded wards for patients, and subtle fortifications that managed to look welcoming while providing protection. "Quite a change from when you first came here," Marshal Henderson said, joining her on the porch. He'd recovered fully from his wounds, though he now wore a deputy's badge instead of a marshal's star. He'd chosen to stay in Redemption Springs, helping to train the next generation of protective healers. "Sometimes change finds us whether we want it or not," Sarah replied, touching the hidden gun that now felt as natural as her stethoscope. "The trick is making sure it changes us for the better." Inside, the evening shift was beginning. Nurses and guards changing places in the carefully choreographed routine Sarah had developed. Each person carried both medical supplies and protective gear, ready for whatever the night might bring. Jenny emerged from the new training wing, followed by a dozen students, including young Hayes, who'd shown a natural talent for both medicine and protection. They'd just finished their daily lessons in what the territory now officially called protective medicine. "Marshal Davies sent word," Jenny reported. "The last of Rawlins' network has been rounded up. The counterfeit medicine trade is pretty much finished in these parts." Sarah nodded, but she knew better than to think their work was done. "There'll be others, different threats, different challenges. That's why we teach what we teach." As if to prove her point, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. But there was no tension in the hospital's response, just smooth, practiced preparation. Within moments, lookouts were in position, medical staff ready, everything moving like a well-oiled machine. It turned out to be just a rancher with a sick child, but Sarah was proud of the response nonetheless. This was what she'd built, a place where healing and protection worked in perfect harmony, where everyone understood both sides of the calling. "You know what Thomas would say about all this?" Luke Hayes asked, joining them after his supervised rounds. His trial had ended in probation, served by helping at the hospital. "He'd say it's exactly what the frontier needs, people who can heal what's broken while protecting what's whole." Sarah watched the last light fade from the sky, remembering all the paths that had led her here. Swift Sally had died in Yuma so that Sarah Cooper could learn to heal. But what had risen from that choice was something better than either identity alone. "We're not just training nurses or deputies anymore," she told her assembled staff. "We're training guardians, people who understand that true healing sometimes means standing ready to protect it." As night fell over Redemption Springs, lamps were lit in the hospital windows, beacons of hope in the darkness. Inside, patients rested under the watch of people trained in both gentle healing and fierce protection. Outside, the town slept peacefully, knowing its hospital stood ready for any crisis. Sarah Cooper, once Swift Sally, now something more complete, made her final rounds for the night. Her gun rested comfortably beneath her apron, her medical bag filled with tools for both healing and protection. She wasn't hiding anymore, wasn't fighting her dual nature. She had become exactly what the frontier needed, a healer who knew how to protect, a protector who never forgot to heal. "Ready for tomorrow?" Jenny asked, falling into step beside her. Sarah smiled, seeing her own journey reflected in her partner's confident stance, in the way Jenny carried both medical bag and hidden weapon with natural ease. "Ready for whatever comes," she replied. "That's what we do here now. We stay ready, ready to heal, ready to protect, ready to teach others to do the same." The night wind carried the promise of change, of challenges yet to come. But Sarah Cooper wasn't afraid anymore. She had found her balance, her true calling, and in doing so, she had created something that would outlast any legend, a legacy of healing protected by strength, of strength guided by healing. Swift Sally's gun might have brought justice, but Sarah Cooper's hospital brought something far more powerful, hope, wrapped in the promise that here at least healing would always be protected by those who understood both the cost and the calling of keeping it safe.